How does a Pentecostal get into patristics?
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So my bachelor's degree is in biblical studies, and I learned Greek and Hebrew there in undergrad. Actually took 5 semesters of New Testament Greek in undergrad, which was, I didn't know at the time how rare that would be, but, just not a lot of places. I mean, there's seminaries that don't teach 5 semesters of New Testament Greek. So in the process of that, I got really fascinated with the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. And there were a couple of places, I mean, as you're aware, where the New Testament does interesting things with the Old Testament. And so some of those kind of bothered me. And one in particular for me, being the arrogant Bible college student that I was learning Greek, I'd heard that Hebrews was the hardest Greek in the New Testament. And so I thought, I'm going to go read Hebrews, right? Which was a bad idea. But I get to the part in, I think it's the end of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2, somewhere around there, where the author of Hebrews quotes Psalm 8, right? And Psalm 8 is this, when I consider the heavens and the works of your hands, what is man that you have mind of him, son of man that you would consider him? Yet you've created him a little bit lower than. And in Psalm 8, it's Elohim, which can mean angels, can mean judges even, but almost always means God. And in the context of Psalm 8, it seems to me like it pretty clearly means God. Now, there are people that argue otherwise. I have a friend who I had this conversation with, and he was like, no, it means angels in that context. I'm like, okay. And so, but at the time, I'm reading it, and I'm reading it in Hebrews, and I'd read Psalm 8 in Hebrew. And so I do my due diligence of, New Testament uses the Old Testament. You go back to the passage, see what's going on there. And I look at it, and it's the Septuagint that says angeloi. And so the author of Hebrews is quoting the Septuagint.
Okay.
And for me, I'm like, well, but if I'm in an exegesis class and I'm exegeting Psalm 8, the right translation is God. Now, again, there are people that disagree with me on that, but that's just that's what makes the most sense to me. So I go to my professor, my Greek professor, and I show him this passage. I'm like, why is it that the author of Hebrews is quoting the Septuagint, which is arguably a mistranslation? And he says, well, he's an inspired author. And I just was not satisfied with that at all. Like, he's inspired to make a mistake. Like, that doesn't track for me. So that really bothered me, and that really kind of set me on a path towards kind of fully embracing postmodernism. Like, if the author of the New Testament can just do whatever he wants with the text, then what anchor is there? Like, we can all just kind of do whatever we want, and truth is meaningless, and and all this kind of stuff. And that's an overreaction, but that's where I went with it. And so I'm kind of just spiraling as a result of that, and looking at other places in the New Testament where there's interesting things going on. When Paul quotes Psalm 68 in Ephesians chapter 4, and he changes it. Instead of receiving gifts, he gives gifts. And you're like, that's the exact opposite of what the Psalm said, So I'm running into this stuff, and I'm like, gosh, this is just whatever. And so I just kind of I put my New Testament, my Greek New Testament aside, put my Hebrew Bible aside, and I'm just like, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Like, we're not going to have an answer for this question. It doesn't matter. And so then my wife and I, we were living in California when I was getting my undergraduate, and we moved back to Virginia a little while after. So in 2008, we moved back there. For about 3 years, I'm just kind of frustrated, and so I try not to get into too many theological conversations, because I have all these questions that it's like, I don't even know who's going to like give me an answer for this that is satisfactory to me. So I'm just going to, whatever. So I'm working at Best Buy doing home theater installation, and I start working towards being a manager for field services, so manager for other installers. And they have us do Strengths Finder, and Best Buy pays for us to do a coaching call with, I forget the name of the company that does Strengths Finder, but they have coaches specifically for, when you take your test, they'll look at your test results and then kind of coach you through, stuff like that. And so I take my test and I get on my coaching call, and she's like, tell me what your normal day-to-day life looks like working for Best Buy. And so I explain, do this and I do this and I do this. And she's like, well, it's really strange. It seems to me like you would hate your job. And I said, well, funny story. I hate my job. And she's like, well, what do you want to do with your life? And I was like, that's not how this works. You're the expert. So why don't you look at my test results and you tell me, what am I supposed to be? And she looks at it for a minute and she's like, my best guess would be that you should be a college professor or something. That's what I think you should do. And I was like, well, that's actually what I want to do with my life. But, those jobs aren't opening up. And, I'm in Southwest Virginia where there is no Bible college. And, there's Liberty, but I'm not going to work for Liberty. We are not a fit for a lot of different reasons. And so I come out of that conversation and I'm just like, I don't really know what to do with myself. Like, the people that Best Buy literally paid to tell me how to do my job, that person is telling me I should go do something else, And I'm like, I also think I should go do something else. Like, maybe, so like, I guess, I don't know. So I'm still just kind of frustrated. Then we get a phone call from one of my wife's friends, and there's a ministry that was kind of like sort of like a YWAM, YWAM, it's sort of like YWAM kind of stuff that was trying to do like immersion discipleship along with like college credits, and they were moving to Christiansburg, which is the next exit down from where we live. And so my wife's friend tells her, like, you need to get connected with this guy who's coming out there because you guys could help him out and all this kind of stuff. And this happens like a couple of weeks after Best Buy tells me that I need to go be a professor. And I'm like, so Best Buy tells me I need to be a professor, and now there's a school moving to my backyard. Like, I guess I should try to go be a professor, So start looking around, and I'd always wanted to go to Gordon Conwell for my master's degree, because when I took Greek and Hebrew in undergrad, we used Bill Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek. We used Pradicone and Ved Pelt for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, and these are all Gordon Conwell guys, right? And so I'm like, that's the place to go, right? That's where I'm going to get my answers. So I start when I find out that this Bible college is going to come basically to my hometown. I'm like, well, maybe Gordon Conwell does like online, or something. I don't know. Let me look. Well, they have a Charlotte campus, and Charlotte's just less than 3 hours from me. And the Charlotte campus was built for people who couldn't relocate for seminary. All the classes are like Friday afternoon, all day Saturday, 3 times a semester, or week-long intensives, or, it's all kind of modified residency kind of stuff for people who can't, move to South Hamilton to go to the main campus. I'm like, that's perfect. Like, that's exactly what I need. Like, I get to go to Gordon Conwell, but I don't have to actually and I don't have to do online because I hate online, and so I get to actually, so I go, I apply. I did not do well as a student. And so my undergraduate GPA was not at all impressive. In fact, I had applied to Fuller Theological Seminary while I was still in California, because my Old Testament professor had his PhD from Fuller, and he adjuncted for Fuller, and I'd kind of like, It's like, maybe I should do Old Testament, maybe I should do New Testament. I don't really know what I want to do. I'm not sure. And so I was like, maybe I'll go Old Testament. I like Hebrew, and, so I applied to Fuller Theological Seminary. I have his recommendation. He's a PhD from Fuller, teaches for them. Fuller tells me no. And I call, and I'm like, hey, I'm curious. My phone's going, or my...
You're right.
Yeah, I'm just going to turn that off. So I called them, and I'm like, is there any... Can I take, like, a class to prove myself? Is there anything I can do? And the guy that is, I still remember his name to this day. I'm not going to name him because I don't want to do that to the guy. But I mean, a little bit I want to do that to the guy. But
You can name names.
But he tells me on the phone, he's like, your application demonstrates that you are not capable of succeeding here on an intellectual level.
Wow.
Yeah. And
That's a heavy blow.
yeah. And I'm like, dude, I have a PhD from Fuller who's saying that I can succeed there. Yeah. Like, your guy is saying, So I applied to Gordon Conwell, and I'm kind of thinking, like, they're not going to let me in. Like, Fuller didn't let me in. They're not going to let me in. I even applied, or I was about to apply to Azusa Pacific while I was out there as well. And I called them in advance, and I was like, hey, here's what my application looks like. Fuller said no. Do I even have a shot? And they were like, if Fuller said no, we're not going to take you either. Really? And I was like, okay, well, I guess I just won't. And it was really discouraging because actually I was at Chipotle in Glendora with my Old Testament professor while I was working at Best Buy. We got lunch together, and I'm talking to him, and he's like, when are you going to start grad school? And this is before Fuller had said no, before APU had said no. And I was like, I can't even afford the application fee. So I don't even know, like, and I've got a pretty loud voice. So we're in Chipotle, and like everybody can hear me. I'm not trying to be loud. I just have that voice that just carries, And so while we're talking, this lady comes up to me from Chipotle and hands me $100, and she's like, pay your application fees and go to seminary.
No way.
And so that I have that, and then I pay the application fee to go to seminary, and seminary's like, no, we don't want you. And I'm like, but God miraculously provided, so I have all this stuff, and so I'm going to Gordon Conwell, and I'm like, it's probably not going to work. It's probably not going to work. So they accept me. Don't accept me on academic probation, they accept me, and I'm just like, I'd rather go to Gordon Conwell than Fuller. Like, nothing against Fuller, but like that's where I've always wanted to go. So I start, and the guy who was I started in the MDiv program because, again, I don't know if I want to do New Testament, Old Testament, whatever, right? So I started in the MDiv because it's just generic, right? Yeah. And the guy that's running the MDiv program at the Charlotte campus is Assemblies of God. And so I'm sitting down with him, and I'm like, I got to say, you being Pentecostal really helps me right now because, like, I was a little afraid coming in here that I was going to be like the Pentecostal guy that everybody was like, that guy, And so it was just really nice being able to start with him. And while he's talking to me, he's like, I told him, I was like, I'm probably not going to stay in the MDiv. Yeah. I'm just starting in the MDiv because I don't know what I want to do. And he's like, that's totally fine. Like, there's all these different, and he starts naming all faculty members. And, like, this guy's great for this, and this guy's great for this. And he says, we also have Donald Fairbairn, who's an excellent patristics scholar. And I remember thinking in the moment, what's patristics? Like, I didn't even know what that word meant. Yeah.
So what is patristics? As a sidebar.
So patristics, it comes from pater, which is both Latin and Greek for father. Patristics is just the study of the fathers. So depending on who you talk to, it's either 180 to, there's some people that limit it all the way down to like 451 at Chalcedon. Fairbairn, and I'm inclined to agree with him because I studied with him, and that's what you tend to do, right? You agree with the people that taught you. He extends it all the way out to 800 AD, so 100 to 800. But everybody kind of has their own, like, period, and periods are fluid, right? It's not like any historical period is like, well, we're done with that. Now we're in the patristic period. Like that is, these are all anachronistic things that we use to look back on back on history.
So sorry to interrupt, but where do the apostolic fathers fit into that? Are they
Yeah.
just before, or do they fit within?
Again, kind of depends on who you talk to, but usually, I mean, as far as I know, apostolic fathers kind of fit within the very beginning of the patristic period.
Okay.
At least that's how I would view them, because they're not the New Testament, but they're kind of like that transition between the New Testament and, people marching up to Nicaea. And so I'd probably put them right at the beginning of the patristic period. At least, that's what I would do with it. There's probably people out there that are like, no, they're, whatever. So, yeah, so I'm in this meeting with Dr. Klipowitz, and just thinking like, I don't even know what patristics is, and so like trying to figure out what I want to do, and start a class on cultural apologetics with Alan Myatt, and that class was a week-long intensive, and I'd thought like, I kind of like apologetics, like I kind of like arguments for the existence of God and stuff like that. And I'd never really heard of like cultural apologetics, but the apologetic side of it, I was like, well, that should be interesting. I'll go into it, and like the whole thing is basically, here's why postmodernism is wrong. And it was everything that I needed, because I'd already kind of like, jumped off into this postmodern world of like truth just kind of doesn't matter, and it's whatever is useful, and all this kind of stuff. And for this week-long intensive, it was like about an hour and a half, 2 hours every day. We'd watch videos by Francis Schaeffer. And at the beginning of the week, I'm like, gosh, this is stupid. And at the end of the week, I'm like, I've been very wrong. I've been very wrong. So that was like the perfect class for me. After that, I'm like, I want to be here. I want to take everything that I can possibly take. I just don't know, like, do I want to go into theology? Do I want to biblical studies, New Testament, Old Testament? Like, I just don't know. So about a year later, I'm taking a class with Donald Fairbairn, the patristic scholar. I'm taking church history to the Reformation. And he starts talking about how the church fathers approach Scripture. And I'd always sort of heard they're just like fast and loose with the Bible, and they just do whatever they want with it. And, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, if there's no anchor to truth, of course we're just all going to, And he starts talking about it, and he's like, they have a rationale. Like they haven't, he's very insistent that they don't have a method, because he's like, basically us trying to impose method on them is anachronistic. They don't really have like an exegetical method, but they have a framework. They have a meta-narrative. They have a worldview that is influencing how they are interpreting the Scriptures. And so that just seemed very attractive to me, that I'm like, well, if I'm ever going to figure out how we should interpret the Scriptures, I should probably look at the guys that the apostles taught, right? Because if Paul's doing weird things with the Bible, if John's doing weird things with the Bible, then they probably taught their followers how to do those weird things with the Bible, right? So that's, maybe I'll figure things out there. So start taking classes with Fairbairn. And in one of his classes, it was a seminar on patristic theology. We read a bunch of Tertullian, who I love Tertullian because he's so incredibly sarcastic, and I really like sarcasm. But we read a bunch of Tertullian, and then we read Irenaeus. Irenaeus is Against Heresies, which is this like 700-page book that's written in the 2nd century, which is just mind-boggling to me. Like what does it look like to write a book in the 2nd century? And how on earth do you produce 700 pages in the 2nd century, right? Like, I can't write 700 pages on a MacBook, right? And this guy is pastoring a church and writing 700 pages against the Gnostics. Just unbelievable. So we're reading Against Heresies, and then in addition to that, we're reading primary source material and then secondary sources, reading people talking about Irenaeus. And Fairbairn has an essay in Westminster Theological Journal, Patristic Exegesis, The Cart and the Horse. And in it, he kind of lays out what he thinks about patristic exegesis and how they approach the Scriptures. And so we read that article, and in that article, he leans really heavily on Sanctified Vision by Reno and O'Keefe. And Reno and O'Keefe in that book basically take Irenaeus as a test case to try to explain patristic exegesis. So I read Cart and the Horse in that class, and he's citing sanctified vision, and I'm like, it seems to me, I'm loving what he's saying, but I'm like, it seems to me like there's even more there in sanctified vision. So I just buy sanctified vision and read that on my own. And that is when like light bulbs start going off. It's the way that the church fathers interpreted scripture. I am convinced, and there's plenty of people that are going to disagree with me on this, but they're wrong. So I am convinced that the church fathers, broadly speaking, I mean, there's some weird stuff, but broadly speaking, they are interpreting the scriptures the way that the apostles did. And that from their perspective, well, let me just use the analogy that Irenaeus used, because he's much smarter than me, right? He uses this metaphor in Against Heresies of a mosaic of a king. And he says all of Scripture is a mosaic of a king that's beautifully wrought in this just incredible masterpiece. He says the Gnostics have come along with hammers and smashed the mosaic into pieces. And they're rearranging the pieces to make it look like a fox. And they're now telling us that the fox is the king, right? And the illustration that what he's trying to illustrate is that your big picture controls your exegesis. And so if you start with a picture of a fox, you're going to interpret the scriptures wrong. If that's your big picture, you're going to interpret the scriptures wrong. It doesn't matter how good your method is, you're going to get it wrong. But if you start with the picture of the king, then you're not necessarily going to always be right, but you're going to have a better chance of understanding the individual pieces in the mosaic because you actually see the big picture and know where they fit in the big picture. And so that to me was like, that's all of the New Testament. All of the New Testament, when they interpret the Old Testament, they are they're looking at the Old Testament retrospectively and reading things in light of Jesus that people back then couldn't read in light of Jesus, right? And so they see things that couldn't have been seen then, but now can be seen because of Jesus. And so they have this big picture that they can work with, that they're like, I know what Jesus looks like, and now I understand how Isaiah 7 fits, right? Now I understand how Genesis 3:15 fits, right? Because I know who Jesus is now. And so to me, that just like, that set off everything. I was like, I just want to read every church father now. I want to understand what they're doing, because it seems to me, and I told Fairbairn this once after 2 or 3 years of studying with him, I said, when I first started reading the church fathers, I thought they sounded like evangelicals. But the more I read them, the more I think they sound like what evangelicals are trying to be and often failing. Because we want to be about the Bible, but we're often like not quite sure what to do with the Bible. Whereas they are like just, Fairbairn and, I'm a big fanboy of Fairbairn. He, big fan. His book, Life in the Trinity, in his book, Life in the Trinity, he says, it is more impressive that the fathers never argue for the authority of Scripture, because they demonstrate their belief in the authority of Scripture by quoting it all of the time. So they don't waste any time trying to explain, here's why we think it's authoritative, or here's why you should think it's authoritative. They just quote it constantly, and that demonstrates that they consider it an authority. Everything has to come back to Scripture, right? And so I think, I told him that I think they're doing what we're trying to do and failing. And he responded, well, you are officially ruined now. And it's like, this happens frequently for Protestants that really dive into the church fathers. Like, at this point, you're basically going to have to decide. Because when I emailed him that, I basically said, so what do I do now, right? Like, I don't fit anywhere, I don't fit with the Pentecostals for sure. I don't fit with the evangelicals, but I also don't fit with the Orthodox, and I also don't fit with Catholics, And he's like, so you're ruined. You're going to have to decide if you want to try a different tradition, or, and he said most students end up doing that. He said most of the students that he's had that dive into the fathers eventually They move up to Anglican or they move up to Catholic or they move up to Orthodox or whatever. He said, but my hope is that you would stay where you are, and that you would just make better Protestants, that you would just improve evangelicalism instead of trying to find the place that's going to fit, that you would just be productive where you're planted and try to, make those people better. Right.
Were you ever tempted is the wrong word, but drawn to any of these other traditions that you mentioned?
Oh, yeah.
And did it kind of jump back and forth as you would read different fathers?
It didn't jump back and forth from the fathers as much as it just so the one example of this is a friend of mine started attending an Orthodox church in Roanoke, which is about an hour from me, and they were meeting in a Lutheran church. There was a Lutheran church that let them use their space on Saturday. So they did Vespers on Friday and then all of their service on Saturday, and then they cleaned up, and then the Lutherans would come in on Sunday. And apparently the Lutheran pastor told them, I love how much incense you guys use, because when I come in, the sanctuary still kind of smells like incense, but he can't do that, right? And so it was fascinating to me. I'm sure Luther would, probably not be fond of that. Though he did have some interactions with Orthodoxy. He tried to get Eastern Orthodoxy to kind of rally against the Catholics on his side. So maybe he wouldn't have had a problem with it. But
for those listening, we have a huge picture of Luther right behind Ryan. You don't think Luther they had incense back in his day, right?
Yeah.
May have even been a big part of his kind of interaction with the divine.
Yeah.
It's a guess. I don't know.
Yeah. So I go to this church, and it's wild. The guy that is the priest, he's like 90 or something. Like, his name's Sam Gant. He's fantastic. I love this guy. He taught at Fuller for like 30 years. And in the midst of him teaching at Fuller, he converted to Orthodoxy. And Fuller just changed his nameplate from Professor Sam Gant to Father Sam Gant, and just kept going, right? Like they weren't bothered by it. But it's wild because he's from Roanoke. So he's from almost my hometown, about an hour away from where I grew up. But he taught at Fuller. And while he was at Fuller, he taught Greek to my Greek professor that I learned from in California.
Yeah.
So it's just like, it's crazy that I'm like running into him in Roanoke, and he's like, I taught at Fuller, and I'm like, did you ever have Mark Duzick? And he's like, yeah, I love Mark. And I'm like, Mark taught me Greek, so you're like my Greek grandfather, So anyway, so I'm at his church, and they would do this like hangout thing after service at another one of the priest's houses. And so I go to the hangout thing because I'm like, it seems like it'd be fun, And a lot of times throughout, all of this time of me trying to figure out patristics and where I fit and all of this kind of stuff, it can often be lonely. Education's isolating, right? I mean, you got your PhD. How many people can you talk to about your PhD that actually understand what you're talking about in any way or appreciate it? That's a pretty small number, and so it's isolating. Like I'm an evangelical that likes the church fathers. I don't get to have that conversation with a lot of people. So I'm at this Eastern Orthodox priest's house, and Father Sam's there. Father Al that's his house, which if you've ever read Eclectic Orthodoxy, the blog, it's got like tens of thousands of followers. Eclectic Orthodoxy is the blog of Father Al, and when N.T. Wright did his New Testament translation, and then David Bentley Hart did his, and then they kind of went to war through blogs with each other. David Bentley Hart's blog responses to N.T. Wright were on Eclectic Orthodoxy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of wild. Like just meeting these people and being like, oh, I actually know who you are. So anyway, so I'm sitting there and I'm talking to Father Al, and he's asking me, who are you? What do you do? The same typical kind of stuff, right? I'm like, well, I have a master's degree where I focused on patristics. And he perks up, right? Because he's like, patristics, you say? I'm like, yeah, I'm really interested in patristic exegesis. And, at the time I was reading Hilary Portier and his On the Trinity, and there's some stuff there that I was like, I think this probably means, and I'm, doing my whole conspiracy theory thing, right? The meme of the guy that's like, all this stuff connects, And as I'm talking about it, again, I have a loud voice. Sam Gant, Father Sam on the other end of the table, says, patristics, huh? And I said, yeah, I studied them in a seminary. And he said, if you know so much of the fathers, what keeps you off of their path? And I just kind of chuckled, and I said, if the Lord opens the door for me to convert to Orthodoxy, then I will happily walk through that door. And so, by all means, pray that the Lord opens that door for me. But until He does, I'm not going to. But going to their church, I went for a few weeks, and I still tell my students about it to this day. There's just some, evangelicalism has this like sort of cloying, like idea that like I tell my students, I'm like, it feels like your church is like a codependent ex-girlfriend, right? Like you go to an evangelical church and they're like, can I get your phone number? What are you interested in? Can we get you connected? Yeah. When are you coming back? Yeah. And it's like just all of this, like, please like us. Please come back, and that just gets old. And you go to the Orthodox service and they're like, we've been doing this for 1,500 years. If you don't like it, there's the door. Yep. And there was just something like, I actually want to come back because you guys aren't trying to make me come back.
Right.
Right. And there's just something about the liturgy. There's something about scripted prayers. I mean, I'm, maybe one of the only Pentecostals you'll ever meet that actually has a rosary that uses it.
No, you're not.
So I mean, there's just something appealing about that stuff. But I mean, there are some things that I'm like, I just can't. A big thing for me is guarding the table in communion. That, if I go to your church and I can't take communion with my mom, that's a non-starter for me. My mom loves the Lord, and if anybody is saved, my mom is saved. And so if she can't take communion at your church, then I don't want to take communion at your church. And so that's a big problem for me with Catholicism and with Orthodoxy in general. I have a lot of friends that are like, it's all the Mary stuff, right? And I'm like, actually, no, the Mary stuff, I mean, some of it bothers me, but most of it doesn't really bother me. Yeah. I mean, I'm in patristics. I've read the stuff from the Council of Ephesus and Theotokos and all that, and it doesn't bother me all that much. Yeah. It's guarding the table, and and I have a former student who's converted to Catholicism now, and every time we hang out, we maybe once a year we'll hang out, and every time we hang out, I'm like, Kurt, am I a Christian? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, can I take communion at your church? And he's like, no. I'm like, so am I a Christian? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, but can I take communion? You see where I'm going, buddy. Like there's a tension here that, and I understand the rationale behind guarding the table, and, I get it, but I just can't get there. I can't get there. But there have been plenty of times where I've thought, man, it might be nice to be Orthodox, or it might be nice to, go to an Anglican church for a while, or maybe be Catholic.
I appreciate your honesty on that. I know for us, like, just real quick, my background was very much Baptistic. Yeah. Basically was born at Grace Community Church in LA, so John MacArthur's church. Yeah. And even went to that seminary years later, but it was only going out to England, well, especially Durham. Yeah. I mean, I have a similar story to yours with the whole getting rejected based upon poor undergrad performance. Yeah. And I didn't do well in undergrad because I was just bored. Yeah. And I remember my application, I had applied to study under Simon Gathercole at Cambridge. Yeah. And a number of other places in the UK, because I figured the scholars that I respect, they came from the UK. In fact, I had been invited to Wheaton to study under Doug Moo. And then in that process, I was also applying to the UK. And I thought, well, where did he study? And it was St. Andrews. Right. It's like, well, why don't I go there?
Why should I get St. Andrews secondhand?
Yeah, exactly. Why should I? Why don't I go to the source?
Right, right.
But I ended up at Durham because I did want Cambridge very much. And Gathercole put my application forward, And I got rejected because of my undergrad grades, which was because I was a mature, as they call it, PhD student.
Yeah.
Meaning I was not 22.
Right.
I think I was mid-30s by that time. I'd already had a professional career, and then I came into an MDiv and whatever. And so it was like, you don't take, like, how can you compare me to the kid just graduating, with his undergrad who has no life experience?
Yeah.
And
maybe he's got a 4.0, but does he know how to do his laundry?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Or does he have like a holistic understanding of life that will inform his scholarship or his burgeoning scholarship?
Yeah.
And so I ended up at Durham under John Barclay because I pushed hard against John. I remember John was like, and again, they were looking at my undergrad, and I said, look, I think I wrote a whole nother like paper of exegesis to submit to him to be like, let me prove to, like you did, like, let me prove to you I can do this.
Yeah.
And eventually he relented. He's like, look, we're going to have you do a master's degree first.
Yeah.
And then we'll see how that goes. And then you can transition into the PhD.
Yeah.
But my point in bringing all that up is he was going to England, where at Durham, importantly, they have the Durham Cathedral, which is now over 1,000 years old. It's this, if you've ever been to England, it's the antithesis of York Minster. So that's right. We talked about this last night. You haven't been to England yet, but you will. But when you go to York Minster, it's the word for it is, it's gorgeous and beautiful, but to the point of being gaudy.
Okay.
There's just so much stuff.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere, and it is Anglican.
Yeah.
Well, most of these cathedrals originally were Catholic.
Yeah.
And I don't know the history of York Minster, but I do know the history of Durham Cathedral, which was a Catholic Benedictine monastery.
Yeah.
And I remember walking in the first time and having the typical Protestant reaction of like, oh, what's all this stuff,
Right.
Why are there statues in here? And stained glass, like. And over the years, what happened is I started to grow an appreciation for the Common Book of Prayer.
Yeah.
I attended a few of these services, and they still, in my ignorant understanding, were still, they're just too Catholic.
Yeah.
That was the word I would use.
Right.
This is too Catholic for me.
Yeah.
And it was only after moving into the second place we lived in Durham, which I told you this last night, is Professor Jane Heath, brilliant scholar, got a fellowship in Germany, and asked our family if we would like to house sit for her. Like, absolutely,
oh, no.
yeah.
Oh no!
And she's like, and by the way, I can't take all my books, and she has this massive library of New Testament. She's a New Testament scholar, but not only New Testament, but there was another library, a whole wall of books in the laundry room that was all like Anglo-Catholic material, including the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And I remember the first thing I did is I'm like, oh, what's that? It's almost like it's too hot to touch.
Right.
But I grabbed it finally off the shelf, and I was like, all right, I'm going to see about this Mary stuff.
Yeah.
Like, that's the first place I went. Is that
Of course.
weird?
Of
Like,
course.
we all do.
Yeah.
Not all of us, but you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
that's the big thing for a Protestant looking at Catholicism. It's like, you guys worship Mary.
Right.
And I looked in there, and I read all this stuff on Mary, and I was like, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
That's not what I expected.
No.
At all.
No.
And that, I think, was the catalyst that led me on this new journey that was very, very gradual, of an appreciation for everything that was going on in Durham Cathedral and in the Anglican churches. And we actually went from more of a charismatic-ish church, which they're amazing, by the way. King's Church in Durham, Mark Bonington is, or at least was, the senior pastor, who's founding pastor as well. Amazing, amazing guy, just in terms of his heart for people and his heart for the church. And it was a very open church theologically, in the sense that they weren't going to hold you, like, it wasn't like a confessional Reformed church, which here in Grand Rapids there's a lot of them here in that kind of Dutch Reformed tradition. So it was very different than that, where it's like, no, you can believe what you want. We welcome you here. Just worship with us. Anyway, we eventually left there to go into more of an Anglican direction until by the end of our almost 10 years there, when we were now, long story, but in London, we worshiped at St. John's Blackheath, just a lovely evangelical Anglican church within the Church of England.
Yeah.
So, but to bring this all the way around, when we moved here to Grand Rapids about 3 years ago, it's been so hard for us to find a church because we experienced what I would call, again, I'm not going to call Anglicanism like the ultimate church. They have their problems like every church does.
Sure. Yeah.
Especially in England, there's all kinds of stuff going on. But it was so hard for us to find a church because it was kind of like these three camps, right? It was the confessional Reformed, which when I was hired by Reformation Heritage Books, so everyone in that circle was at either London Baptist Confession or a Westminster Confession church.
Yeah.
I think so. Or maybe even a Dutch Reformed. Some people were at Dutch Reformed, which is a whole nother level. And then, there was that camp. There was the evangelical camp, which would include some wonderful churches like Crossroads downtown. There's the big Calvary Church. There's Grace Hudsonville out west a little bit. But they're exactly what you talked about. In fact, we visited another, I won't say which one it was, this Sunday. And I remember we were trying to leave. It was a great church and a great service, but my daughter was still a little bit sick, and we just needed to go.
Yeah.
I remember one of the greeters, young, really nice guy, comes up and he's like, "Hey," the whole spiel, and he's like pushing a contact card in front of me. I'm like, "I'm good, man." Like, I was trying to be nice. I'm like, "So all this stuff, all these handouts, like they're on the website, right? Like hint, hint, like I want to leave."
Yeah.
And but it felt very pushy.
Yeah.
As sweet as the guy was, I just was like, "Hey man, if I want to come back, I'll come back.
Right.
I don't need to do the Connect card.
Yeah.
Thank you very much."
Yeah.
Compare that to, this story's getting too long, but compare that to when sorry, because I want to hear more about you, but I want to show you that this journey, like you're not alone on this journey. And I wouldn't say I've converted to Catholicism yet.
Yeah.
But at 4 p.m. today, I'm meeting with a guy regarding the RCIA program, Roman Catholic Initiation. Is that right? Roman Catholic Initiation for Adults. It's basically for if you weren't a cradle Catholic, but you're interested in the Catholic Church and want to know more, you enter that program, which then culminates in like an Easter service where you're officially brought into the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So again, for those of you listening who know Tavis from years and years ago, I'm not converting to Catholicism yet, and I'll pull it out because now I know what's on your wrist. This is my rosary.
Okay. Yeah.
And it sounds cheesy, but this is Matt Fradd, Pints with Aquinas, that podcast.
Okay. Yeah.
So he's got this. There's the Catholic woodworker who's got these beautiful rosaries.
Yeah.
But it's funny, like I still haven't got to the point where I pray to Mary.
Yeah.
I actually developed my own, what I call it, a Trinitarian rosary.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you do with yours?
This is an Anglican one, and so there's an app called Venite that is a digital Book of Common Prayer. And so I pull that up on my phone or I pull it up on my iPad.
Yeah.
And I go through the Book of Common Prayer, and there's specific places in the thing for each of the beads, and then for me personally, I've added kind of like in addition to whatever that tells me I should be saying, these first two beads. In addition to that, I pray about my family.
Okay.
And then
nice.
I do the Lord's Prayer, and then I have prayers for people who have either walked away from the Lord or who are particularly struggling right now, and then Lord's Prayer again, and then prayers for any needs that have been like specifically, somebody said pray for me or something like that.
Yeah.
And then on the last one, I'll pray for anything that is, I'm having a problem with or I need help with or something like that. But all the 10 beads, these are all the Lord's Prayer, and then you come back all the way around, and then you're done.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think ours are similar. So I do the Lord's Prayer. No, the Lord's Prayer is on the big beads, the Our Father.
Right.
The little ones are. I'm forgetting now because I'm shamefully I haven't done it in a while. But on each of these, what do they call it, the decades, or whatever? I'm probably getting it wrong. Is different actually from the church fathers. Whether there's Jerome, there's Augustine. Is it Basil?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Basil the Great.
Basil the Great.
Yeah.
And there's one by Gregory. Is that another one?
Yeah.
There's these Trinitarian prayers that I found that I pray those along these ones. But distinctly, each one is devoted to, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So 3 of them are devoted to a particular member of the Trinity.
Okay.
So it's Father, Son, and Spirit,
Yeah.
obviously. And then the 2 bookending it are more general Trinitarian prayers.
Okay.
And man, I can't tell you how much that's like changed my prayer life.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the way that in my prayers I'm not so self-focused.
Yeah. And
it's a type of prayer, this rosary prayer, I guess the one that I've been doing is more not asking God for things, but acknowledging who he is.
Yeah.
So I found it to be very healthy for my own life. But anyway, the last thing I was going to say is that whole journey was in part predicated by the fact that I did a lot of preaching in Durham at the churches I was at alongside doing the studies. And I don't know how it started. I think it's because I was also working for Logos Bible Software, which is something that's how you and I got to know each other.
Yeah.
But I remember in Logos, I could bring up all these ancient commentaries.
Yeah.
And instead of peppering my sermons with stories about like my dog or something my kids did, which I'd never liked that kind of preaching.
Yeah.
I started putting in citations from the fathers.
Right.
Like whether it was Chrysostom or Augustine or Jerome or whoever.
Yeah.
And I found every time I would preach, I'd have 1 or 2 people come up to me and be like, I've never heard the church fathers preach in a sermon like that before. Like they were so interested, you know. Most people didn't say anything, but I just that again, and it made me wonder. It's like, well, who are the church fathers, and like, why have I viewed them as suspect? As an evangelical for so many years, when, as you say, they were so much closer. I had a question though for you because you talked about the mosaic in the sense of the mosaic of a king. Yeah. Did you say that was Tertullian?
Irenaeus.
Oh, Irenaeus. So there's the mosaic of the king that's then been changed by the Gnostics. Yeah. Or this Gnostic approach to a fox. Yeah. And so, and you made a statement, something to the effect of the apostles were interpreting the Old Testament, or the writers of the New Testament were interpreting the Old through this mosaic of Christ because they saw and knew him. Yeah. My question, though, is as we get through this period, which you described as 100 to 800 AD, with each successive generation, they're further away from, I mean, with even the first generation, they haven't actually seen the risen Christ or walked with him like the apostles did. Right. Well, most of the writers of the New Testament, right? Yeah. So could we make the argument that the further you get towards that 800 mark, things get a bit more out there and distorted, or is that not?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of that for sure. That the further you get from the apostles, the easier it is for people to go in very weird directions with things. And I do think that over the course of history, you know, I wouldn't presume to say that like I've figured it out, you know, because I'm not, you know, a Mormon, but you know, Joseph Smith has recovered the gospel, and you know, but I mean, I think that there is like a, you know, we have to kind of always come back to Scripture. We're not reading, you know, so like one of the differences that I would have with the Catholic approach to the fathers is that frequently the Catholic approach to the fathers has them set as an authority, whereas I would see them more as like dialogue partners. So I would see, Irenaeus or Tertullian or Augustine or whoever as like having a conversation with you. Somebody who loves the Lord, who's devoted to him, devoted to his word, and has reflected on that. And now I'm looking at their reflections and trying to see, like, how does this inform my reflections? Maybe they're right about it, and maybe they're not, and maybe we're both wrong, But I wouldn't see it as, I'm not reading the Father. This is the evangelical theological retrieval project, right? That everybody's all about theological retrieval right now. And there's a whole lot of different approaches to it. And some of them are like, we're going back to the fathers to try to get the right answers. And I don't think that works. Not least because the fathers aren't answering the same questions that we are, and so I think we go back to the fathers, and they do have, they do have maybe more authority than, you or I, like if I'm having a conversation with you about the Bible versus, reading Athanasius' On the Incarnation. But there's stuff on the Incarnation that's like, yeah, that ain't it, Chief. I mean, it's kind of like, it's sort of like the fanciful stuff that's like, that's inspiring, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily true, right? So like,
but how can you make that judge? How could any one of us make that judgment?
Yeah, I think
like basically, what's our authority then?
Right.
Besides, as an evangelical or a Protestant saying the Bible.
Yeah.
Which isn't. I'm not invalidating that answer.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, wouldn't Athanasius say the same thing?
It's possible. Yeah. I mean, I think the one that comes to mind, because I was literally just listening to it in the car on the way up here, is he talks about how that Jesus to reach both the Gentiles and the Jews has to die in a manner that both of his arms are out, because one arm is reaching out to the Jews and one arm is reaching out to the Gentiles. And it's kind of like, well, I don't know that that's true. Like, I mean, so like if the Romans had crucified him with his hands nailed up, like it wouldn't have worked, Like, I just don't know that that's like, it's kind of like an inspirational sort of like, oh, that's beautiful. But also it's like, I just don't know that it's true,
I could honestly hear any number of pastors today say the same thing.
Absolutely.
Without blinking an eye.
Right. And it's the same thing as like, Athanasius says that he has to die lifted up because Satan is the prince of the power of the air. And so for Jesus to redeem the air, he has to die in the air, And so it's like, well, I don't know that that's, it's an interesting take and it's maybe inspirational, but I don't know that had Christ died a different way that it like we wouldn't have, been saved, Mm-hmm. And so there's stuff like that it's like, I guess the way that I should put it is I am more willing to disagree with you than I am to disagree with Athanasius. But that doesn't mean that Athanasius, I'm more willing to disagree with Athanasius than I am with Paul, Mm-hmm. So like, I'm not going to disagree with Scripture. If I'm going to disagree with Athanasius, and it's like the guy that I was talking to you about last night, that when I explained, my initial doctoral work was on Proverbs 8 and the Arian crisis and all that kind of stuff. And I explained Arianism to him, that Jesus is a created being. And his response was, well, I think Jesus is a created being. Mm-hmm. Like that should make you uncomfortable. If you were looking back 1,700 years and saying, yeah, I disagree with everything that they said and that what we've all agreed on for the past 1,700 years, that should give you significant pause. That doesn't mean that they're authoritative. It just means that when we look back on them, we have to say like, okay, well, they're really smart. They hammered all of this out. We're not going to just throw all of that out casually and start all over. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite patristic scholars is Orthodox guy, John Baer. John Baer is like if Origen were reincarnated, it would be John Baer. Because I read that guy and like, I don't always understand him, but he always makes me think. And that's exactly the same feeling I get reading Origin. I don't always understand what he's doing, but he always makes me think. But, John Bear, I think it was John Bear that said this. I could be mixing him up with somebody. But I think it's John Bear that said, you can't get Nicene theology without Nicene exegesis. And that, like, evangelicals tend to, we want to say that Nicaea is like, that is mere Christianity. That is like the ground, and everybody has to agree on that. But then when we talk about how they got there, we're like, no, that's not how we read the Bible. You're like, well, you can't get that the way you read the Bible. Like, that just doesn't work,
Yeah, because it seems like we just take the creeds in a vacuum.
Yeah.
We're
And
it adheres with Scripture.
Yeah.
Therefore, we can lift it out of its historical and theological context.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super ironic that we make Nicaea sort of the standard for orthodoxy, when the 4th century is a hot mess, and Nicaea on its own in 325 resolved very little. It's not until Constantinople in 381 that things really start to be put to bed. And even then, Ephesus is a clarification of Nicaea and Constantinople, and Chalcedon is a clarification of Nicaea and Constantinople. Because they keep circling back to, well, what do we mean by that?
Yeah.
And so we make it like, but if you look at Nicaea, it's, when I teach historical theology, like, one of my favorite things to point out is, if you read like the original Nicaea, when you get to the anathemas, it says, and we anathematize any who say that there is more than one hypostasis in God. But Orthodox Trinitarian theology is that hypostasis is the Greek term for person. But in Nicaea, it was the Greek term for nature.
Oh, wow.
And it's not until Constantinople that hypostasis takes on that meaning.
Oh, wow.
So literally...
So the word had changed over time?
Yeah. And it isn't even that it changed, as far as I understand it. And I could be wrong here. Just want to say, for any of our listeners who are experts in the 4th century, I could totally be butchering this, because I'm still in the process of trying to be a patristic scholar. And, I'll eventually get there 30 years from now, But as I understand it, they basically, by Constantinople, said, we know this isn't what hypostasis means, but that's what it means for us, because we need a word that means person, and we don't have a Greek term for that really works. So we're just going to say that's what we mean when we say hypostasis. Because there's persona in Latin, but in Greek it was like, we're not really, there's this, is it ousia? Is it phusis? Is it, what are all these terms? Which one do we use for which thing? And so by the time they get to Constantinople, they're like, no, we all agree now. That's how we're going to use hypostasis. It's the term that we use for the threeness of God. But in Nicaea, that's anathematized, So we want to look at Nicaea and be like, that's the standard. And we're like, well, Constantinople's the standard, but even Constantinople, like, needs some clarity, because they keep kind of circling back and saying, like, well, what about this? And what about, so it's one of the things when I first started PhD work and looking at Proverbs 8 and the 4th century, excuse me, sort of the Bible for that is The Search for the Christian Doctrine of God by R.P.C. Hansen. It's like 800 pages, and it covers 318 to 381. And it's 800 pages, And you read through that, and you see how many councils there are. And we look back, and we're like, yeah, Nicaea was the first ecumenical council. And you're like, well, in retrospect, yes, but there's all of these other councils that are kind of vying for that at the time. And the way that we teach it just sort of almost imagines that those didn't exist, But there's this huge controversy of these people to get together and they're like, you're a heretic. And then those people get together and they're like, no, you're a heretic, And it's just a hot mess, and it doesn't really settle down for a while. So I think, when we're reading the Fathers, it's really easy in this like theological retrieval project. It's really easy for us to just kind of proof text the Fathers and just sort of grab something from them and say, here's, this is what he said, and you're like, but is it though? Like, have you read anything else by that person? And do you know what they're saying in their context? One of the things I'm presenting a paper at a regional ETS in a couple of weeks. And the paper that I'm presenting is Athanasius's Doctrine of the Atonement on the Incarnation. Because R.P.C. Hansen, in his massive, which not at all trying to throw shade on R.P.C. Hansen, that book is like unbelievable, But in it, he says Athanasius is so fixated on the fact of the incarnation that he can't come up with an explanation for the atonement. That he has no doctrine of the atonement.
Yeah.
And I think he's wrong. I think Hansen is just wrong. And I think he's reading Athanasius through our context, expecting to see in Athanasius the way that we talk about the atonement. And of course you're not going to see that, but that's one of the things that's fascinating to me as I've, progressed through academia is, I spent a lot of time on biblical studies in my undergrad, spent a lot of time on biblical studies in a master's degree. My master's degree was kind of half biblical studies, half patristics. And it's like, like with the New Testament's use of the Old Testament conversation. How many people in that conversation say anything about patristic exegesis? Almost no one, right? It's like these groups just don't talk to each other. And yet there's insight over here that might be helpful over here if we just talk to one another. And I think the same thing is true in reverse, because, what I'm going to argue in my paper is that Athanasius's Doctrine of the Atonement kind of centers on honor and shame. And when you do, exegesis in the New Testament or the Old Testament, social science stuff is all over the place. Like we all kind of recognize like anthropology matters, and understanding cultural background matters. But then when you go to people talking about the fathers, they sort of talk about Augustine or Athanasius or whoever like they're them, and there's not a lot of conversation about like, well, what's their cultural background and what's motivating them to say the things they're saying, and Athanasius, part of the reason that I was listening to it on the way up here is because I if I'm going to present a paper on it, I need to really, really understand this work. And so I'm just like, I'm going to read through it again. I'm going to listen to it a couple of times, and I'm just going to try to really get my head around it. And I mean, he starts the whole thing with, first of all, and John Baer points this out in his introduction on the incarnation, that when Athanasius says the incarnation, he pretty much means the passion. Like his focal point for the incarnation is the passion. It's not Jesus being born. It's not Jesus's life. It's Jesus's death. And you can see this because when he starts out, his like thesis is, in layman's terms, like, I'm going to respond to the Jews and the Gentiles because the cross is offensive to both of them, right? And so the whole book is just a response to both of those groups. And he talks about how they despise the cross and how they despise Jesus for being crucified. And then he talks about how we venerate the cross. And the whole conversation seems to kind of wrap around Jesus is taking shame for us so that we can take his honor, right? That there's this exchange between, and that's the climax of On the Incarnation is God became man that man might become God, right? That there's this exchange that Jesus has taken on our shame. He is shamed for us in the most shameful death possible. And when he's talking about these, like, stretching out your arms and dying in the air and all this kind of stuff, he's going through all these different ways of what should God do? Why, how should God save? Well, that's honor language, right? Like what should God do? Well, why should God do anything, right? for God to be honorable, for God to maintain his reputation, here's what God ought to do. And that looks like the cross. And, he even says, a good wrestler, speaking of like Greco-Roman wrestling, right? A good wrestler doesn't pick a weak opponent, because if you pick a weak opponent, then the audience, especially if they're hostile to you, are going to say, well, you're nothing because that was a weak opponent, right? He's like, if you're a good wrestler, you'll even let the audience pick your opponent because you want to prove that you can triumph over anything they give you. Mm-hmm. And he uses that analogy to say, this is why Jesus was crucified, because a less insane death, a less horrifying and shameful death would have just been kind of brushed off. He had to show that he could triumph over the worst, right? And so throughout that, on the incarnation, to me, I mean, it just seems massively apparent that Athanasius is constantly using these really loaded honor and shame terms. But you only notice that if you spend time looking at stuff on honor and shame. And I mean, not everybody that even does New Testament gets into that, because there's a whole debate about, whether or not social science criticism is worthwhile, right? And so, historical theologians, like, you say honor and shame to historical theologians, and their like first inclination is like, oh, that's missiology. That's contextualizing the gospel to people in Japan because they have an honor and shame worldview, right? And you're like, no. I'm not talking about that side of things. I'm talking about understanding the text. I'm talking about, we don't normally talk about like exegesis of Athanasius, right? We don't really talk about like trying to understand, okay, what is he saying? Because we sort of read it and assume we just understand what he's saying, but he's coming from a Greco-Roman context in the same way that Paul is. Yeah. And so if honor and shame is impacting Paul, it's impacting Athanasius, right? And everybody else in the Fathers.
So I'm really interested in the fact that it seems your frustration with going all the way back to reading Hebrews and being able to reconcile this Elohim language, is it God, is it angels, set you off on this journey. Do you feel that now, in the midst of PhD studies and teaching as you are, that you've gained some resolution, not on that specific issue in particular, but just on this larger question of, reconciling possible issues in even the New Testament's use of the Old Testament and how we understand Scripture even today?
Yeah.
Or has your confusion increased?
My confusion has moved to different areas. I do think I feel comfortable now. I'm not saying that like I've solved the problem and but I do feel comfortable now with New Testament's use of the Old Testament in general. Like as a topic, that is not something that like keeps me up at night anymore. The analogy that I use for it is it's like a musician covering the song written by somebody else. Okay, so for instance, the best example of this in my mind is 9 Inch Nails' "Hurt," right? It's a very 9 Inch Nails song. Yeah. And then Johnny Cash covers it, and it just takes a completely different shape.
It's better.
Yeah, it is in every possible way. And Trent Reznor agrees, right? Trent Reznor, when he heard Johnny Cash's version of it, he was like, that's his song now.
Wow.
Right? Wow. Like, it's his. He did something with it that I couldn't even imagine, I mean,
that's a great way of describing it. However, I remember just in my seminary days, for example, or even like before seminary, going up to my pastor and asking, well, how does this resolve?
Yeah.
And it just seems like there's a lot of gymnastics and hurdles that people will go through, especially as evangelicals, where because we take the Bible as the authority, we have to make sure that everything in the Bible reconciles with itself, or else we're going down, this is what they say, we're going down that slippery slope towards postmodernism, towards liberalism, towards agnosticism, whatever the horrible term is, because, Paul contradicts something in the Old Testament, or a New Testament author says something that, or uses a different terminology.
Yeah.
And there's different ways of doing that, right? It's like, we can explain it through whatever lens, or we can say, they were using the Septuagint.
Yeah.
Right? And so how would you say, though, that we should resolve these issues? Do we just say it's like, covering a song? And because I don't know if there's a lot of people who won't accept that answer.
Sure. Yeah. For me, I think it's, like I know there are harder issues in New Testament use of the Old Testament, but to take one that is perhaps less thorny, Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah has an idea of Emmanuel in his immediate context, right? His immediate thought is not Jesus. His immediate thought is Hezekiah, right? Like he's got an immediate context for the fulfillment of that, and we have to maintain that, because we can't say that Isaiah 7:14 meant nothing to Isaiah's immediate audience. It's not like God was like, hey, I'm speaking to you, but not actually. I'm speaking to people hundreds of years down there, and this means nothing to you, right? So there has to be something to the original context, and that to me is Nine Inch Nails' Writing Hurt, right? And then Matthew comes along and takes Isaiah and says, and that's actually about Jesus. And Isaiah looks at that and says, that's your song now. Like you've done something with that I couldn't have seen coming, right? And I think that generally, that is the framework that I approach the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. Is there's an intention in the Old Testament by the original author to the original audience, and we have to respect that intention, right? We can't just go looking for Jesus everywhere in the Old Testament and find him in everything, right? I remember there was a book that one of my students read for some reason. I can't remember why, but they brought it to me and they were like, I'm really confused by this. And I was like, well, what does it say? And they were like, well, it's talking about Jesus in the Old Testament and about how we see him in all these different places. And I was like, well, I mean, there are places that we see Jesus in the Old Testament. I mean, when we read it, retrospectively, read it theologically, like there are places we see Jesus. And they're like, yeah, but they said, we can see that Jesus in the Ark of the Covenant, because the Ark of the Covenant had physical dimensions and Jesus had physical dimensions. And I'm like, that is the worst possible way to see like literally everything has physical dimensions. I see Jesus in that 2x4 because it has physical dimensions and he has, and so there's stuff like that. Like, we really need to avoid that kind of thing. We need to start with the intention of the human author in the initial context. Like, what did it mean to them? But then look back on it and this is informed for me by my initial PhD research. I started out at Ridley under Scott Harrower and Mike Bird, and I was doing reception history of Proverbs chapter 8, and so I was reading a lot of Gadamer and a lot of stuff on reception history, Wirkungsgeschichte, and all this kind of stuff. And shout out to Andy Judd for helping me understand Gadamer, because understanding Gadamer is no small feat. And I don't know that I ever actually got there, but he got me closer. But in all of that reading and all of that trying to understand, what's going on here, that's kind of what pushed me towards this reception history approach to New Testament's use of the Old Testament. That this is a cultural artifact that had an intention and a meaning in its original context, but that cultural artifact maintains, and later somebody else takes that cultural artifact and assigns to it a new meaning. And that doesn't mean that it's contradictory. We can say that the human author has this intention and this human author has that intention, but the divine author intended both of those things, right? That doesn't particularly bother me. I think that helps with, just understanding why people would do things that they do. Why does, Matthew say that out of Egypt I've called my son is fulfilled, when Hosea 11:1 is a reference to the Exodus. It's not a prophecy for the future. Well, I think Matthew is saying throughout his gospel that Jesus is Israel, and everything that happens to Israel has to happen to Jesus. And so Israel has an Exodus, Jesus has an Exodus, and so I think that's, Matthew is taking that cultural artifact and he's saying, well, that's true there, and that's what that means there, but it also means this here, and I think Hosea, just like Isaiah, would be like, that's his song now, right? He did something with that I didn't anticipate.
How much material is there in the Church Fathers?
Oh dear, that's a lot.
Could you realistically read all of it?
No, I don't think so.
Because
if you devoted your entire life, maybe, but even Augustine, just Augustine by himself is like, it's absurd.
Really?
Yeah, it's
because
absurd.
I know, going back to my time in Durham and living at Jane Heath's house, I forgot about this until now, but she had this side room that I turned into my office for the 3 years we were there, and it had not the entire collection, because I don't know how big it is, but hundreds of the Loeb classic series, both the red and the green. And for those listening, if you don't know what they are, the green is Latin, right? And
I'm not sure.
And the red is Greek.
No, I think it's the other way around. It's the other way around. Because I have a Tertullian and it's red, and Tertullian wrote in Latin. And I think it's red.
So the red is Latin.
Red is Latin and green is Greek. Hey, green, Greek. There you go.
Yeah, I don't know why I thought Latin for green. Anyway, it was so impressive, and I would pick those up every once in a while as I was still learning, Latin, and I had Greek, but not the classical Greek.
Yeah.
So that was challenging. But compared to the Loeb series, which I think is hundreds and hundreds of volumes.
Yeah.
How much material is there in the Church Fathers?
Like
how many Church Fathers are there?
I don't even know that I can answer that.
Really? Because this is my ignorance. I thought there were a handful.
No.
And I know that haven't there been discoveries of more patristic writings in since kind of like critical scholarship came around the whole
there was
period.
Origen is like one of the big names in patristics, and we just found, I don't remember what year it was, but it's been within the past 100 years. We found his dialogue with Heraclides, I think is the guy's name, and Origen is being called in to examine whether or not this guy's a heretic. And so he has this conversation with him. It's a fascinating conversation because he says, do we confess that there is one God? And he's like, yeah. He's like, so there's not two gods? I'm like, yeah. He's like, so are the Father and the Son the same, or are they distinct? And he's like, they're distinct. He says, so is the Son God? Yeah. Is the Father God? Yeah. So do we confess two gods? And the guy's like, in a sense, we do. And Origen stops him because he's like, okay, it's going to get complicated here. So let me talk about what I mean. But he had just kind of wrapped him up in the conversation and kind of forced him into this corner. And then he's like, okay, I'll let you off, and we'll talk about what we're getting at here. But that's been a recent discovery. And there's occasionally stuff like that. There are a lot of church fathers. I mean, there's the big names that most people are going to be acquainted with if they have any acquaintance with church history. But there's also, there are people that I remember. I was at a New Testament Greek conference at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is where I'm finishing my PhD. But I was there, and this was I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. It was a long time ago. Long time ago. It was a while, And I'm sitting there, and everything's New Testament Greek. So it's all these guys that are MDiv, and all very Baptist. It was great. And I'm getting to know a few people, like in between lectures, like you sit beside somebody and, I'm sitting beside this one guy and he's an older fellow and he's like, so where are you from? And I, tell him, and I'm like, I did my graduate work in patristics. And he was like, oh, I did my dissertation on Afrahat. And I didn't say this, but I thought, who's Afrahat? Like, I've never heard of that guy. Yeah. And he's a church father, and we have literature from him, and this guy did his dissertation on him, and I had spent years reading church fathers and had never heard of this guy, or just the name had never stuck, And there's still occasionally, it was a couple of years ago that, I should probably be more ashamed of these things than I am, but admitting to my ignorance of Afrahat and others. But, it was, 3-4 years ago when I was starting at Ridley that I ran across Lactantius, and I'd never heard his name before. And we have writings from him, and he's actually a fairly important person.
I've never heard of him.
And I have no idea who this guy is, know?
Yeah.
I read a year or two later, I read John Dixon's Bullies and Saints, which is a phenomenal book. And he talks about how Lactantius influences Thomas Jefferson. And like it's wild. Like I'm reading it and I'm like, I actually know who that guy is now. This is crazy. A couple of years ago, would not have known who this person is.
I kind of ask you that because as I said, I've been reading through the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and the footnotes in the Catechism are fascinating.
Yeah.
It's very readable, much more than I expected. But there's so many names in there I've never heard of.
Yeah.
And these are church fathers. And if you know, which now I know a little bit more about Vatican II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Vatican II was an opportunity, among other things, for the church to incorporate all of the new things that they had discovered from the patristic era and incorporate that into this, what would you call it, a church council or a...
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I'm not an expert on Vatican II, but as I understand it, it was mostly just kind of like, let's update things. And that's that's when the door kind of opened a little bit towards Protestants. We're separated brethren, and so that's like, it's not all the way open, but there's some light shining through,
Yeah.
So
yeah. And that gets back to that communion issue because the guy sitting behind you, glaring at you, his view of communion is probably very different than yours.
Yeah.
And he probably wouldn't let you take communion.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of material. So what is are you focusing on a particular church father or a topic within the patristic era?
Yeah. So Steve McKinnon is my advisor at Southeastern. And so I transferred there largely. I have nothing bad to say about Ridley or Mike Bird.
You can say anything bad you want about Mike Bird.
Yeah. You'll sign off on that.
Yeah, I'll sign off on
that. Mike and Scott were fantastic. Both, I was very surprised, honestly, at how pastoral both of them were. Just wonderful, wonderful people. Mike is hilarious and very sarcastic. And Scott is a big fan of heavy metal, and I'm a big fan of heavy metal. So we got to, connect on that. He introduced me to some new bands that I'd never heard of, and so they're great guys. But being a distance program, it got to be kind of isolating, and when you don't have people that you can talk to about your research, it's depressing.
Yes.
And so I reached out to them and they were real nice about it, but they're basically like, there's really not a mechanism for that. We're like 15 hours apart and we all have full-time jobs. Like there's not really a good mechanism for us to like hang out or anything, like it's, and so I reached out to Southeastern. Southeastern surprisingly, I didn't know that this would even be possible because Ridley's a European style program. You do one class and then it's all dissertation. And so I was like, I don't even know how that transfers, And Southeastern transferred it all in as directed studies, and so it really worked out for me.
But why Southeastern? I'm sure you had other options for supervisors who specialize in patristics.
Yeah. Initially, I went to Ridley because Bird is one of the few New Testament authors New Testament scholars. Bird did not write any of the New Testament.
He did the hipster Bible, though.
He did the Biblia Hipsteria. Yeah. That's one of the funniest things he's ever done. That and his Council of Nicaea rap battle.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, it is perfect. But yeah. Gosh, what was I saying? Got tracked.
Bird is one of the few New Testament scholars.
Yeah, scholars, not authors. Scholars. Thanks. That actually engages with historical theology pretty substantially. Mm-hmm. And so I chose him because I was like, I don't want to just be a patristic scholar. I don't want to just be a New Testament scholar. I kind of want to try to help maybe bring those two things together.
Yeah.
And so that's why I went with him. Fairbairn, my advisor at Gordon Conwell, had always told me to go to Southeastern and work with McKinnon, like from the outset, was like, this is where you should go. This is what you should do. And, being the rebellious person that I am, I was like, no, I'm going to go somewhere else. And so then the more lonely it got, the more I was like, well, Fairbairn was probably right. I probably should go to Southeastern. And so I reached out to McKinnon and I was like, hey, is this possible? And he's like, yeah, absolutely. And so I transferred in and it's been really helpful. He is a big proponent on translation. And so currently the plan, which, may change, because the nice thing about being in this kind of program is I'm not actively working on my dissertation right now. I can still kind of workshop ideas, but the plan is to try to find something in Origin that either hasn't been translated or hasn't been translated in like 150 years, and then do some translation work for my dissertation. That's my hope. If not, there's some other stuff I can work on with Origin. I really like him. He's crazy, but I like him. He's just a lot of fun to read, and yeah. So right now, I'm kind of going through the available sources for Origin to see like what is it that we have, whether it's in Greek or Latin or something else, and building a spreadsheet of that, and then going through to try to find like where have those things been translated, to see like where are the gaps and where's the need, and like is the need big enough that it would justify, if I translate one sermon of Origin, that's not really a dissertation,
Right.
But if I can translate, a collection of sermons of his and do an introduction to it, then that might justify a dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the goal right now. I'm going to take classical Greek this summer, which I'm kind of excited about. And we'll see how it goes. I've done some Latin over the years, and I need to just sharpen that. But yeah, so that's the goal, to see if I can do some translation. And then honestly, I'd be happy if my academic career for the rest of my life was just doing translation, because there's some ideas that I have that I wouldn't mind publishing as a paper or something,
sure.
or stuff like that. But generally speaking, like I think, making things available to people. I like the idea of resourcing people and just being a resource to the church. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
And I could imagine that out of that translation work, you could have a lot of ideas that could end up as papers.
Yeah.
Origin wrote in Greek?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of what he has, we only have in Latin, but he originally wrote in Greek. Yeah.
We only have in Latin. What's the manuscript evidence for the patristic fathers, for someone like Origin?
It varies. For his, so for instance, his On First Principles, which is his systematic theology, Rufinus translates it in the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century, and we pretty much only have copies of Rufinus. And every now and then we'll have like a paragraph in something in Greek, but pretty much we just have the copies of Rufinus. John Baer just did a new translation of On First Principles, and he basically produced his own critical text of it from what we have in Rufinus and what we have in Greek. And then I think there might have even been a couple of manuscripts in like, Amharic or some random other thing. And so you can buy either his translation of On First Principles, or you can buy the Diaglot that has the critical edition and the translation.
Okay.
The Diaglot's like $200, so I don't have it. But I have just the translation. It was like $35. I was like, that's worth it. I'll take that.
Set up a Patreon account.
Right. Yeah.
So some people listening might throw in money like the lady at Chipotle.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Email Bear and be like, hey, I'm a poor PhD student. Can you maybe send me? Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess back to the original question, as a Pentecostal.
Yeah.
Well, are you staying within Pentecostalism, and is that, or how is that informing your approach to patristics?
Yeah. So the rest of the interview is just going to be in tongues.
The translation work. Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, there we go. I'm a Pentecostal, and depending on the conversation, I'm sometimes a reluctant Pentecostal. It's a difficult tradition to be in sometimes, because there's a lot of just crazy stuff, but I'm ultimately a Pentecostal because I'm convinced by the text, by a lot of the distinctives of Pentecostal theology, and so I believe that speaking in tongues in the New Testament is not one simple thing. I think it's multiple different things depending on the context. I think sometimes it can just be like in Acts chapter 2, somebody supernaturally having the ability either to speak or to hear a different language. I don't know that the text is perfectly clear as to which one of those is happening, but one way or the other, that would be like a known language, right? That would be me speaking French, even though I know very little French, or you hearing French and understanding it, even though I'm speaking English, right? Something like that happens on Acts 2. But outside of that, I think in Paul, we get an idea of tongues and interpretation in a church that is not a known language. I don't think that the best understanding of what he's saying in Corinthians is that would be a known language, because it doesn't make sense that the interpretation would be a supernatural gift. If somebody is speaking, if I'm speaking French, like it stands to reason that somebody in the church might know French. Why would that need to be a supernatural interpretation? And so it seems more like that is some kind of like ecstatic utterance that is then interpreted supernaturally. I do think, and this is where I get in trouble with Pentecostals, I do think we have to hold a really hard line that tongues and interpretation in the church only occurs if there's interpretation. Because Paul literally says that, right? Like he literally says that if there's no interpreter, that you need to stay silent. And so one of the things that frustrates me in Pentecostalism is, people pray in tongues from the stage and into the microphone, and
like
there's no interpretation.
Nobody can benefit from that.
No,
because there's no interpretation.
No, and Paul says the one that prays in tongues edifies themselves. And so you are edifying yourself, but you are drawing attention to you edifying yourself. That's just not a biblical thing to do. Now, I do also think that Paul seems to indicate that there's some kind of prayer language that is a private thing, because the one who prays in tongues edifies themselves. He doesn't say the one who prays in tongues is wasting their time, right? That there seems to be some kind of benefit to doing that. It's just, it isn't a public benefit. And so I think there are, and there's other reasons for that. He says, I pray in tongues more than you all. He says that when I pray in tongues, my mind is unfruitful, but my spirit prays, stuff like that. Excuse me. So I'm convinced by the text of those sorts of things. I'm convinced of, women in ministry, at pretty much all levels, and all of those sorts of things. And so doctrinally, I find myself theologically most at home within Pentecostalism. Practically, I find myself often frustrated with Pentecostalism. It also has a strong tendency towards anti-intellectualism, which isn't to say that all Pentecostals are anti-intellectual. I'm a Pentecostal. I'm not anti-intellectual. Craig Keener is a Pentecostal. No one on earth could ever accuse him of being anti-intellectual, right? His 4-volume commentary on Acts is just inhuman that exists. And so, but there are trends of Pentecostalism that lean in that direction that get to be kind of frustrating sometimes. Even, I work at a Pentecostal institution. I work for Life Pacific University, and I teach at their extension campus in Virginia. And they're, we're fighting the good fight in Pentecostalism, but there are even times in things at life where it's like, I don't know that I am fully comfortable with that, and so that's a challenge. So I agree. I'm licensed and ordained with the Foursquare Church, International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, and I affirm Foursquare doctrine. But there are times when I visit an Orthodox church and I'm like, man, that would be nice. That would be nice. My wife and I and my children, we don't actually attend a Foursquare church every Sunday. I'm involved in a church plant by a former student of mine, and it is a Foursquare church, and I help with that. But our church attendance every Sunday is actually at a Southern Baptist church, and largely that's because my son's autistic, and finding a church where that works is often challenging. And so that church has been very good for him, and it's been very good for my wife. It's been very good for me. But the priority, the primary reason that we're there is that it's been good for my son.
What's the difference? Why is that one good versus other churches that you've been to?
It's more organized and more consistent. So my son knows what he's getting. Whereas in other churches, children's ministry, and I think mostly rightly so, tends to be very erratic and very chaotic and very, it changes a lot, and I think that's probably a good thing for 90% of children.
Yeah.
Because children are very chaotic, so it's a good, you want them to be kind of in an environment that their chaos is allowed to, within parameters, just sort of, go nuts. That is not good for my son. He does not do well in chaotic environments where everything is changing and it's bright and then it's dark and then it's loud and then it's quiet and then, he just does not do well with that. Whereas the church that we go to, it's a very Baptist church in a good way. They have a high priority on congregational singing, so the music is never too loud because they want you to be able to hear the person singing beside you. And there's no like sharp transitions or loud noises or it's just very calm. And then we sit in the balcony, and in the balcony there's a window on the far side of the balcony that looks out on the street. And so we sit up there, and Marshall sits by the window and just stares out the window for the entire service.
Interesting.
And he loves it.
Yeah.
He'll see a dog walk by, and he'll tell me, "Daddy, there's a dog," or he'll see a cat or a skunk or, whatever, and he really likes animals. And so, whenever he sees an animal, he'll elbow me and be like, "Daddy, look, there's whatever."
What a beautiful thing. I mean, like during a service that, I guess there's not a way. We've talked about this a bit because my son is autistic as well. And what I was going to say is, the thing you're supposed to do is eyes on the preacher,
right?
Pay attention,
right?
And your son Marshall, who knows how much input he's processing,
Right.
while at the same time
Right.
being
Watching the
observant
dog.
of just life and nature outside.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we started sitting in the balcony, we would sit in the main congregation, and the way that I knew that this was the right church for us was, Marshall will get up and bounce, or there were days where he would sit in my lap and I'd cradle him like a baby.
Mm-hmm.
He is not baby sized at all. He's currently 5'2", but when I was cradling him, he's probably like 4 foot tall, or a little bit shorter than that. But I'd cradle him, and he would just kind of rock in my arms, and everybody around us just that's just what he does.
Yeah. They didn't give you any grief.
Nope. I even had a guy come up to me afterwards one Sunday, and he said the most meaningful thing to me this Sunday was watching you father your child.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Like you parenting him and loving him, that spoke more to me than anything else in the service.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just holding my kid, I wasn't this was not performative, I'm just trying to and the best story by far though is, and this is when we decided to start sitting in the balcony. It was one Sunday, our pastor, he'll preach, maybe 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. I mean, it's a very intellectually oriented crowd, and he's a great preacher. He's, not everybody can preach for 35, 40 minutes and it not be, death. Mm-hmm. So, and so he's really good. Well, one Sunday, maybe he was going long, I don't know. But Marshall, sitting beside me, just stands up and looks at me and says, "When's he gonna be done?" and the pastor, I mean, we're like 4 rows back, this is not hidden, right?
Okay.
And so everybody in the church kind of chuckles, and the pastor's like, "I'm wrapping it up now, buddy,"
Awesome.
and it just, there was no can you keep him out of, or there's nothing. It was just that was really funny,
I love that, man. This is a big thing for me. I haven't really talked about it much, except I process it a lot. But having an autistic son, there's something so beautiful about having children in the service just kind of doing their thing. And I'm not a fan of cry rooms at all. Yeah. It's let them cry, man.
Yeah.
Let the kids be here and participate. It's
right.
There was a thing going around on X a few days ago about children being in weddings. And how there's some people who are
Please don't bring kids. Yeah, yeah.
Or a bride who's really getting upset about some kid crying in the thing. It's no, they gotta be here.
Yeah. It's almost like Jesus said, "Don't forbid the children from coming to me."
Yeah.
Right? Almost,
exactly. And there was a church in England we were at for a little bit, and we had the dearest friends there. A guy I'm still really close to. He was doing a master's while I was in the PhD program, and they were new parents. They had 2 kids, and one was a newborn, I think born there in England. And I remember, kind of in the British way, the head pastor gave it was right before a sermon, the announcements period. Mm-hmm. And he was from the pulpit, not directly to them, but saying, essentially, please don't bring your children in, especially if they're going to make noise. We invite you. This very kind of, the British subtext was get your damn kids out of here.
Right.
Right. We don't want your kids in the service.
Yeah.
Take them to the kids' room or just sit sit outside kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they left because of that, which was really sad.
Yeah.
So I just love to hear stories like that, because it is what would you say is this a problem in the church? I mean, we see, according to some people, there's a rise of autism, or at least its diagnosis.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into that whole issue, but it's something that the church needs to acknowledge.
Yeah.
It's not just happening with kids, but there's people who are adults who are finding out they are autistic, which again, it's a massive range from, I don't know what Marshall is, whether he's verbal or not.
He is. Yeah.
He is verbal. Okay.
Yeah.
So my son's verbal too, so-called high functioning, but highly challenging.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah. And then yesterday you and I were talking a little bit about this because of Grant McCaskill's book on autism in the church.
Yeah.
So I'm glad there's people focusing on it, but still, we've had issues too sometimes with. I always, every time we visit a new church, it's like I dread the kind of like when the youth pastor pulls you aside. He's like, "So, can we talk about your son?"
Right. Right.
And sometimes it can be really positive.
Yeah.
I'd say for the most part, it has been where usually it's a guy who will be like, "Hey, we love the Aces here.
Yeah.
How can we support him?"
Yeah.
That's awesome. Whereas other times, some people have not been so friendly about it.
Yeah. So I was at a youth conference on Saturday. This whole trip was like halfway into Ohio for a youth conference, and then further up into Ohio to preach on Sunday, and then now I'm in Michigan with you. So it's been a wild ride of a weekend. But at the youth conference on Saturday, I'm not really like a dodgeball person, right? Like I've passed my dodgeball age, right? But I'm, just watching the kids and it's fun. And at lunchtime, this kid just, he's sitting by himself and I was like, well, I mean, there's nowhere to sit. I'm just going to ask him, like I'm some dude that he doesn't know, but I'm going to see, so I walk up and I'm like, is it all right if I eat here? And he's like, yeah. And so I sit down and like, I'm there 10 seconds and he's info dumping on Knight Rider.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And this like 14-year-old kid, and he knows more about Knight Rider than anybody in the world. Right. And he's just, and I have this moment where I'm like, I'm really enjoying this because he reminds me of my son. How many people would sit here and listen to him talk about Knight Rider?
Yeah.
Like how many youth pastors are going to be absolutely amped to hear that, all this, the first episode of Knight Rider, the brake lights were different. He
knew that?
He knew that. Yeah. He's like, I just sent an email to this YouTube channel to tell them like, hey, I don't know if you guys noticed, but in the first episode, it had the standard Trans Am brake lights. It didn't have the normal kit brake light, And I'm like, wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
And so then like I'm walking around the halls later and this kid, like literally I'm walking down a hall and this kid's like, hey, did you know there's a sparkle muffin peacock spider? And I was like, what? Like, and he said it faster than I can say it, but he's like, yeah, sparkle muffin peacock spider. They just found one. It's a thing. And I was like, oh, that's really cool, And in my mind, I'm like, do you know that you're autistic? Because that's like the most autistic thing that any, like, we're not even like, he's like over here and I'm walking and he's like, hey,
Because he found connection with you.
Yeah.
And I know for my son, that's really hard.
Yeah.
To find people who will connect on that kind of level where they're actually interested in the things that he's really keenly interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what, I was trying to explain my son to one of my friends one day, and I was like, his love language is info dumping. Like, that's what he wants to do. He wants you to sit and listen while he tells you everything he knows about Batman.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or about animals.
Is that Marshall's thing?
Oh, yeah.
Batman.
Yeah. Okay. Batman, sometimes Marvel Universe, but mostly Batman.
Yeah.
And then animals.
Yeah.
He's obsessed with animals and wants to know everything about animals. Also, movie release dates. At any point, if there's a movie that he wants to watch and there's a release date for it, he will tell me multiple times a day. Like, I'm excited to go watch the new Captain America on February 14th. Did you know that I'm excited to go watch the new Captain America on February 14th? Yeah. And I'm like, buddy, I'm pooping right now. Can you please, can we please talk about Captain America maybe in 20 minutes? Just, and so we've had to get to the point with him where we're like, did you hear me? that I said I heard you? Like yes, I know. Did you hear me?
Yeah.
And because we just want to help him. Like, I don't want to motivate him to mask or like restrict himself or. But I also want him to be able to interact with people, you know. And so trying to thread that needle has been challenging. But that's the first thing that made me start to think like, you know, I'm probably autistic because I think my love language is info dumping. Like, if we were to meet for lunch somewhere, like it would not ever occur to me to ask you how your family's doing. And that's not because I don't care about your family, but we're both theology nerds. And so if we're going to lunch, I'm going into that conversation excited that I get to be nerdy about, you know, theology and New Testament and stuff like that. Yeah. So the moment that we sit down and we're like, so new perspective on Paul, what do you think? Yeah. You know, like I'm just going to go, like we're going to, and that's what my son does, you know? And so in that conversation with that friend, I was like, I think maybe I'm autistic, you know? And since then there have been a bunch of other things that like, I don't think normal people do that either, you know? I was talking to my therapist about it the other day. I said, I was like, I don't really have extemporaneous conversation really ever. I have like bottled things that I've thought about already and that I'm ready to talk about at any moment. And I basically just wait for certain keywords and then I just pick the right bottle to go with that keyword. And then I'm like, here's my prepared speech about that topic, you know? And I was like, I don't think normal people do that. I think normal people probably just are interacting on a regular basis. But for me, it's like, oh, you asked me about Athanasius? Well, here's my Athanasius jar. And so here's everything that I know, you know? And so it's stuff like that I'm like, yeah, I think I'm probably on the spectrum, you know? 'Cause that's not how normal people, normal people tend to approach things. So
what was it like for you, I guess, calling it a discovery?
Yeah.
What was it? Did it change anything about the way you think about life or yourself?
It did. It helped me a lot with accepting myself. Because I
didn't before that?
No, I've always had self-esteem issues.
Okay.
And I still do.
Yeah.
But
was it kind of, were you comparing yourself to other people?
Yeah, the biggest one, the example that I give of not asking you about your family, right? That's a jar, right? Like I'm explaining.
Which you haven't done this whole time.
Yeah. But I met them, so
You met them. That's even better.
But my Hebrew professor in undergrad, he and my Greek professor both. I used to go out to lunch with them, eat individually all the time, right? And I would go bother them and like, hey, when can we go to Chipotle? Right? Like I want to talk about something. And anytime I would go out to lunch with them, I mean, it was exactly what I just described. Like we would sit down and I would have something already that I'm like, here's what I want to talk about, right? What's going on with Hebrews quoting Psalm 8, right? You know, like I've got something I want to talk about. Well, years later, I'm talking to one of my friends that I went to undergrad with, and he says, something about the Hebrew professor. His name's Jim. He's like, yeah, Jim skateboards. And I was like, Jim skateboard? How do you know that? And he's like, how do you not know that? I go to lunch with him as often as you do. And I'm like, right, but I don't ask him about his hobbies, So over a few more conversations, he'd say like, well, Jim's sister in Oregon, like I didn't know he had a sister and I didn't know she lived in Oregon. And it just started like stuff like that. I was like, am I just a bad person? That I don't care about other people and their families and their, and so it wasn't until recently when I kind of made this realization that it's like, I'm not being selfish. Like it's a good thing for me to try to think through, like, should I ask somebody about their family? right? And so like when we talk about talk on Facebook, like I'll ask you about your son.
I was just going to say, like, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Many times you've asked me things
Right.
like that. You've asked me, like, how's the job search going? How's
Right.
your family doing? Whatever
Right.
is going on.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Like, is that is that different medium? Like, what is different about that medium that you would do that? And not in someone's actual physical presence, like at lunch.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I don't have a jar for that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah. So like, I mean, I know like, I'll ask about your son, and a lot of times it's like I'll experience something with my son, and I'm like trying to like navigate that or something, and I'm like, and I wonder how Tavis is doing, and I wonder how his son's doing, and so it's not really like I'm sitting down to lunch with you and I'm like, I want to ask you about your family.
Right.
It's like something happens that reminds me like, oh, this is also in somebody else's life and I wonder how they're doing with that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I'll have a friend who's, having a hard time finding a job, and I'm like, oh, the job search. Yeah. I should ask Tavis and see how the job search is going, but I mean, if we went to lunch, like those probably wouldn't, if there was like a lull in the conversation, I would ask those things.
Yeah.
But I would sit down and like, tell me what it was like going to John MacArthur's church, like
that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Like I would sit down and like, there are things that I'm like, tell me about this. Like, what is this? And how, and so it wasn't until recently that I was like, this is not a flaw in me. And that doesn't mean that I shouldn't ask people about their families.
Right.
But it's not, that's just a different, like another guy that I went to Life Pacific with, he said he thought one of our professors was autistic because he's like, if you pay attention, all of his responses seem to be scripted. And if you ask him something that he couldn't anticipate, that he doesn't have a script for, he gets upset.
Oh.
And that is what that conversation with him, like literally probably 10 years ago, is what set me up to think about the jar thing.
Yeah.
Is because it was like, oh, I do that. Like if you think he's autistic because he does that, I do that. And I have like these scripted responses that are like, oh, you said this, I'm going to say this, because that's what you say when somebody says that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then if something happens that's like, oh, I don't have a jar for that, I'm like, I don't know what to do right now. Like that moment in Talladega Nights where it's like, I don't know what to do with my hands. You're just like, I don't know what to do right now.
So you've said that this realization has helped you to be more accepting of yourself or something like that. Explain like what that looks like now, like post-discovery.
Yeah. So I'm just not as
like you have an autism jar now,
right?
And I'm assuming isn't just for yourself, but also for your son, or just that. Is it like that, like a general category of autism, or is it more like, well, maybe even within that general category, there's smaller jars for me and for Marshall and for you met my son last night, who was very reticent to he doesn't want to meet strangers, right?
Sure.
So
that's new stuff, right? He's not used to it.
No.
Yeah. I think, I mean, mostly for me, it's just I've spent a lot of time with my internal narrative being, here's how I need to be better. Like here's and I mean, I still struggle with that to this day, that like, I should be eating better. I should be exercising. I should be reading Latin. I should be reading Greek. I should be working on German. I should, and there's just a big long list of all the should, stuff.
Yeah.
And so the autism thing has just helped me like, there's things I should do, but I'm not a failure. Like I'm not, I'm different, and in specific, one very specific way that it's helped me is I don't feel shame for resting anymore.
Interesting.
Where before, because of all the should stuff, if I'm sitting and watching TV, I would think, man, I should be working on my German. I should be reading Athanasius right now. I should be writing the paper. I should be, all the different things. But I realized, like, if I spend some time watching TV, those things get easier. But if I don't spend time watching TV, all of that gets harder. And I explained it to one of my students this way. I said, have you ever played like a RPG where it's like you've got like 3 different abilities to attack with, and they're, one of them you can just hit as many times as you want. The next one you can only use that like every 3 rounds, and the next one you can only use every 6 rounds, right? And like, there are a lot of things that I can just do any day that aren't difficult for me. But there are some things that like I need to wait a few days after I do this because I can't do that anymore, right? And then there's some things that it's like I got that in me like once a week, and just being able to articulate that and like give myself space to just like lay in bed and watch Big Bang Theory, like it's just nice. Like I'm not being lazy. I'm not, being a bad person. I'm not being a bad scholar. I'm not being a bad father. I'm not being a bad, whatever. I'm just letting my cooldowns recharge, and that needs to happen, and so that's been really helpful. Like just being able to take time with my wife and just watch TV and just, I don't need to get anything done right now. Like I will get things done tomorrow, or maybe I won't. Yeah. Maybe I'll get things done on Monday. Maybe I'll get things done on Tuesday. And just giving myself space for that like, because I see in my son when he gets overwhelmed and he just shuts down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And I've just never given myself space for that, where I'm feeling overwhelmed and I'm feeling like I'm going to shut down. I've just never given myself space to say like, hey, take a break. Like just put everything on the shelf and just forget about it for a little bit. I've just never given myself space for that.
Yeah.
And usually what that's meant is I've ended up taking the break because I needed it, but I feel bad about it. So it ends up not helping because like I spend all day playing video games or I spend all day watching TV, but the whole day I'm like, gosh, I shouldn't be doing this. There's so much other stuff to do. I shouldn't be doing this. So I end up falling behind while resting,
Yeah.
and I never actually like get the benefit of the rest. Whereas now, like, if I take a day off and just kind of watch TV or whatever, like I find that after that, the next time that I pick up a book to read, I have so much more energy to be able to read that book and comprehend what's happening. When I give myself a break to think about the paper that I'm writing for ETS, when I come back to that paper, I have so many more ideas. But when I'm just trying to push myself through it to get through all of it at once, you get to a certain point and you're like, nothing after this point is going to be productive, right? It's diminishing returns, right? You're just going to keep pouring energy into it and you're going to get basically nothing back. So just go take a break and watch TV or,
I struggled so much with that during all my years in academia.
Yeah.
From my MDiv all the way through to the PhD, it was just like every day I have to wake up and I got to crush.
Yeah.
I got to wake up early.
Yeah.
And I remember I would do 4 to 5 hours of sleep some nights in seminary. And I'm not saying that's bad. Sometimes I needed to do that.
Sure.
And then I tried to carry that into my years in England.
Yeah.
Doing the postgraduate work, but it was so destructive for my marriage.
Yeah.
I was so hyper focused on all the things you just mentioned. I mean, it's so busy, right? You've got to learn all these languages. You have more reading to do than you can possibly accomplish.
Yeah.
And at some point, you actually have to write something.
Yeah.
And I was trying to do all other sorts of things to like set myself up for a job in academia as well, like publishing papers and presenting at every conference I could. And it's like, well, what I should have done a better job. I should have been just as focused on making sure that Friday or Saturday night I was taking my wife out somewhere, but it was hard for me to rest. And I remember about 2 or 3 years in, maybe it was 2 years in, when we had moved to England, and we were sitting there in our postgraduate offices, and we had this great little office kind of on the corner down from the cathedral, and they'd built these new postgraduate offices, and in there we had all theology guys. All of us were all from the U.S. 3 or 4 of us were from the U.S. One guy's from the Faroe Islands. Another guy was from, he's going to kill me because I'm going to get it wrong, Norway. Sorry, Sammy. Keep Scandinavian. And anyway, one guy made a joke one day like, oh, we're all getting PhD bellies. And I was like, oh, no. And I think that week I signed up for a sprint triathlon. I'd never done a triathlon, I mean, I was in the Navy, but that was years ago. Yeah. And I used to train real hard back then, but I hadn't really kept up with it. Yeah. And so I started doing all the stuff, running and biking and swimming. But every time I went to train, and it would only be an hour a day. Yeah. I feel so guilty. Yeah. I was like, I should be sitting at the desk reading Tom Wright, learning about the new perspective on Paul and digging deep. My topic of study flirted with that whole area of study. Yeah. And I just always felt so guilty doing something that actually ended up being very beneficial for me. And actually, when I would come back, I'd feel much more refreshed and ready to go. And it made me eat better and sleep better. It's a hard thing, man. And I think in today's culture, too, there's such a, this whole focus on what is masculinity. Yeah. Especially, I mean, I know women have their own struggles with this whole thing too, but for men, it's like you have to be like someone who goes out and crushes it and does cold plunges and does all the stuff. Yeah. And what I haven't seen is much of an emphasis on rest. Yeah. I'm sure there's people talking about it, but that isn't as loud of a voice as all the things you're supposed to be doing every single day to just crush it. And honestly, I find that now being in my mid-40s, I just don't have the energy that I had when I was in my 20s. I just don't. Yeah. As much as I would like to say that I do, I don't. I really don't. I can't do 4 to 5 hours of sleep. Right. I die. The next day I'm done. Yeah. I'm so, but with that constraint, that physical constraint, the benefit then is that I try to maximize the available hours of the day that I do have. Yeah. And not just, I think I'm doing a better job of spending more time or focusing more on being more intentional about family time than I was, but I'm not perfect still. I'm still always just dropping the ball, man. Yeah. Yeah. So I could imagine though with someone, because having an autistic son, and actually, we have another member of our family who's autistic, which I'll talk about in another podcast episode at some point. But there is this somewhat of a tendency towards obsessiveness about the thing that they're interested in. My son is all about weather. Yeah. Always wants to know what's going on with the weather. I installed a weather system on top of the house that connects to a little monitor he's got in his room. Nice. And he's all about that, I'm always hearing about wind speed, temperature, the weather for the next couple of days. He wants me to verify it on my Apple phone, all this kind of stuff. Yeah. He always knows what's going to happen. Yeah. Weather-wise. So that's kind of cool, you know. Yeah. I mean, Knight Rider would be fine too, I guess. But anyway, I'm sure that can be hard, right? Yeah. Just because you find something that you're interested in and you want to, I don't know, fill the jar. Yeah. Yeah. Does the jar ever get full?
No, I mean, I think, so the jars are just it's just like speeches. It's just, it's like a research paper, right?
Okay.
Like all the jars are just like preset, like you say this thing and I know like here's all the information I can give you on that, right? And so that's all that is just like all these different things that I can talk about that, ultimately what it comes down to is like ways that I can be useful, right? I want to try to make myself useful to people.
It almost sounds like the way AI works.
Yeah.
Like these neural networks that
Right.
they're trained on this data,
Right.
and then they're able to output answers based upon now like more advanced reasoning type stuff.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the video if Google was a person?
No.
It's got some inappropriate moments in it because obviously it's talking about, if what people Google, right? But it's but it's this guy in an office, and the idea is the guy in the office is Google, and somebody comes into the office and sits down and asks for the weather. And so then he's
I have seen this.
He's like, here's all of the, and like one of them was vaccines cause autism. And he was like, I have this many results that say it doesn't, and I have this one result that say it does. And she's like, okay. And she takes the one result. But it's that sort of thing where it's like, here's the information that I have, and so I'm just waiting to figure out what information is relevant to the conversation so that I can, here's what that is. For a lot of things, it's, partially it's, I want to be useful, and I want people to like appreciate me or whatever. But it's also like, it's like the Knight Rider thing. Like, here's something that I love, and I just want someone to participate in loving this with me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I just want to like share that, and like, and that just, the difficulty of having that sort of a approach to things and that personality when you're a theology nerd is like, how often do you get to actually do that? How often do I get to actually talk about Irenaeus and the Mosaic metaphor and why I think that really helps us with the New Testament's use of the Old Testament? Most people can't understand that sentence, let alone care about what is behind that, and so there's just a lot of those jars that just, they get a lot of dust on them. So
how do you think though that as a patristic scholar, you can be most useful to ultimately? I would say that as a ordained, minister within the church, your heart is for the church. So, but how can you take all of this information that you're learning and be useful to the church when, as you say, most people would be like, who? Irenaeus. And I was like, what's that?
Yeah.
Like, where's the receptive audience outside of... in my example, the three people who read my PhD on pseudo-philo, which most people don't know who that is either.
Right.
So where's the usefulness? So I mean, if you could cast kind of like the vision of where things for you would be in 10, 20 years, what does that look like?
So, I mean, presently, the way that, I have to think through how what I'm saying is useful and I have to filter what I'm saying. Let me put it that way. I don't want to say, if I say like I have to dumb it down, that sounds demeaning, and that's not really what I mean, and so I have to filter what I'm saying for the audience. And so sometimes that means I don't say Irenaeus, I don't say New Testament's use of the Old Testament. I just say, there's an early Christian who uses this metaphor that helps us with biblical interpretation.
That's good.
And so I filter what I'm, because that might actually matter to the person that I'm talking to. But the moment I say Irenaeus, they're lost, right? Like they're gone, And so presently, like, the Zoom call that I had this morning, there's a church local to me. It's not the church that I attend. They do, they're Foursquare Church, and they do sermon planning once a week where they talk through their sermons for the next 3 weeks. And so I go to that every week whenever I'm in town, and they do it on Monday mornings. And so that's why, I had the Zoom call this morning. They, last weekend had John Walton in town, and some of the people in the sermon planning team were disturbed somewhat by some of the things that John Walton said. And so this morning, I told the pastor in charge of the sermon planning, I said, if you want to give me a Zoom link or something, then I can Zoom in for half an hour or something, and then just try to kind of contextualize what he was doing, and try to help fit that with what you guys are trying to do and that sort of thing. And so that's what I did this morning. They were bothered by one of the people in the sermon planning thing was bothered when Walton said that there's no devil in the Old Testament. And what he's trying to get at is there's nobody reading Genesis in the original audience is going to read the serpent and say, Satan, the enemy of God, and read all of this theology into it.
Right.
That's not
right.
That's just not in their framework. That doesn't mean that that's not who the serpent is. It just means that in the original audience, that's not how they're going to read it, And so they were bothered by that. They were bothered by some of the messianic prophecy stuff that he basically was like, Isaiah's talking about somebody in his original context, And they're like, well, so the Old Testament doesn't point to Jesus, And so I had a conversation with him this morning, and I was like, we want to find Jesus everywhere, and he's just trying to say, let's start with what it meant to the original audience, and let's anchor ourselves there, and then, as we move, we can have more, theological readings based on what happens in the New Testament or what happens in church history or whatever. All of God's people always want to know, what does God's word mean to me? And we just want to make sure that we aren't just jumping straight to that. We want to try to anchor ourselves to the text and say, what is the text saying? And what have the people of God said? And that sort of thing. And so I was like, guys, he said there's no devil in the Old Testament. He's not saying the devil didn't exist in the Old Testament.
Right.
He's just saying that the Old Testament literature is not giving us that, right? And so just trying to kind of walk them through that sort of stuff. So that's, the kind of stuff that I do. And even with the church that I attend, they do sermon planning. And when I'm able, it conflicts with my job. So I'm not able to go with them as often. But when I'm able, I go with them as well. And that's the one that I mentioned to you that we got into the big war over Wayne Grudem and the eternal functional subordination of the Son.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's those sorts of things where I'm in a conversation. I mean, these are people that, they're pastoring and been pastoring for 15 years. They don't have time to stay up on every little conversation in theology. And so if I can do that for them and help contextualize that stuff for them and help, get them to where they're like, oh, okay, I get why that conversation matters and why these people would say these things and, stuff like that. And so in that way, I mean, I just see myself as a resource for the church that, the tagline that I use whenever anybody asks me, like, why do you do what you do, is bad theology ruins lives. And I've distilled that down from my experience with my grandfather. My grandfather on my mother's side was basically my dad growing up. My dad died a week before I turned 1, and so I grew up with no actual father, but my maternal grandfather my mom took care of. My mom's a superhero. She's going to be listening to this. Hi, Mom. I love you. You're amazing. She raised me, my brother, and my sister while also taking care of her parents after my dad died. And so, it's absurd that any human being would be able to do that, right? So my grandfather was always a part of my life. My grandmother, too, but since I didn't have a dad, my grandfather was kind of that figure for me. And he was 70 years older than me, 72, 73 years older than me. And so he was, we weren't playing catch, we were, sitting in his living room, watching Price is Right, or Andy Griffith or something. But we would talk about Jesus because he really loved the Lord, and I have his Bible. His Bible's falling apart. It's one of those Bibles where the leather bound part of it has separated fully from the rest of it. Because that's just how much he read it. And he really loved the Lord. And I remember him telling me one time that he had been taught at some point in his life that he could commit the unforgivable sin. And he was terrified that he was going to die and go to hell because maybe he had accidentally committed the unforgivable sin and, just didn't know it. And I'm not even a Christian at this point. I'm like 7 or 8 or, I'm not, I'm just having conversations about Jesus with my grandfather. And he died when I was, I think, 13 or 14 years old, thereabouts. And then after that, a couple of years after that, I became a Christian. And just looking back on that, all these years later, like you can teach something in a church that someone will hold on to for 70 years in terror.
Yep.
And it can ruin their life.
Yep.
And that doesn't mean that, like, that doesn't mean there's no grace, right? We make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. Nobody can preach perfect sermons, right? But it does mean that, like when I get invited to preach, there's a massive difference between teaching and preaching. When I'm teaching, I'm just conveying information. And, guys, I could be wrong. Here's where I fall on this. Here's a couple of different perspectives on it, like da-da-da-da-da. If I'm preaching, I'm trying to deliver the words of God to you. And that has tremendous consequences. And, again, it's not that there's not grace, but, the people that just sort of like fling together a sermon and get up and, I went to a church one time that I tend to, like I said, want to be a resource for the church. And I told a pastor after his sermon one time, I only ever talk to somebody after their sermon if I'm able to be encouraging. I'm never going to go up to somebody after they preach and say, here's all the things you did wrong, right? Like, that's not a good idea. But he had said something that lined up with something in Greek or something in the background of the text, or I don't remember. And so I just wanted, since he knew that I was there and I'm a Bible college professor, I wanted to be able to go up and say, I'm not sure if you knew this, but what you said lines up perfectly with da-da-da-da-da, right? Just to encourage him and to be like, hey, I'm not the Bible nerd that's like taking notes on all the things you messed up, So I tell this to the guy, and he's like, oh, man, I wish I would have known that before I preached. And I was like, well, if you want to, like, get together and talk through your sermons, like, I'd be happy to, like, provide content for you, like you just want to get together and, like, have lunch or something on a Monday or a Tuesday. Yeah. And he said, and I'm not kidding, and he's not exaggerating, he said, I'd love to do that, but the way that God has gifted me, I put my sermons together in about 15 minutes on Saturday night.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. And so
what does he do the rest of the week?
Plays golf with his friends and.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean,
I'm not saying you got to do like 35 hours a week, like
sure.
some people advocate for, but
sure.
I think Piper spends all day, or used to spend all day Friday.
Yeah.
To prep his, maybe a little bit on Saturday.
Yeah.
And I know everyone's got other responsibilities, but.
But 15 minutes on Saturday night is like...
I've never even heard that.
Yeah. Now, fortunately, he's not in ministry anymore. I have nothing against him at this point. I just don't think he should be pastoring, and he's not anymore, and so I think that's a good thing. Nothing against him personally. But it's those sorts of things that, I run into that occasionally in Pentecostalism where, and I share this quote with my students all of the time, probably 2-3 times a semester. There's a quote from Ben Witherington. in his book, Is There a Doctor in the House, which is his
That's
book.
a great book.
Such a good book.
Yeah.
On whether or not you should get a PhD and what it looks like to get a PhD and da-da-da-da-da. So there's this one line in that book that I will never forget. I quote it all the time. So he says, somebody came up to him in either an exegesis or a homiletics class because they were like, this is too much work. And they said, Dr. Witherington, do I even have to do all of this to preach? Can I just get in the pulpit and the Spirit will give me utterance? And Witherington said, you can and he will, but it's a shame you're not giving him more to work with.
Yeah.
And I share that with my students all the time. I'm like, I'm not saying God can't work through you, right? I think it's Tim Keller that has a book on preaching that says your preparation can make your preparation or lack of preparation can determine whether your sermon is bad or good. Only the Holy Spirit can make a sermon great. And the Holy Spirit can make a bad sermon great, or he can make a good sermon great.
Yeah.
And I think that's accurate, right? Like a terrible sermon can still, because of the Holy Spirit, impact tons of people and do all sorts of good in their lives, in spite of the fact that it was a really dumb sermon, right? And a really great sermon can actually do nothing at all, and it's all what the Holy Spirit's going to do. But we should try to give him more to work with, and so that's my challenge to my Pentecostal students is like, yes, we should believe in the Holy Spirit, and we should believe that the Holy Spirit is active in our lives and does things and does weird things sometimes and all about that. But the Holy Spirit is not a labor-saving device, right? Like you can't just get up and, I cringe anytime somebody gets up and they're like, I had a whole sermon planned and I'm throwing it all out because God wants me to talk about da-da-da-da-da,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And look, is it possible that God did that? Yeah, it's possible. We'll see how the sermon goes, like maybe God wanted you to do that. But a lot of the times that that you're saying that God did that, I feel like all of the things you're throwing out are just empty pieces of paper. Like you didn't prep anything, but you just want to make this big show of like the Spirit is leading me. And like, come on, man. The Spirit can lead you on Monday afternoon when you're prepping your sermon. He doesn't have to lead you on Sunday. He can lead you on Monday afternoon to that because he knows what's going to happen on Sunday. He knows who's going to be there, and he can lead you on Monday afternoon to write your sermon for Sunday. He does not need to wait until Sunday morning and like a panicked college student in a caffeine-induced rage throw something together at the last minute. He doesn't need to do that, right? You may want him to do, but yeah, anyway, I'm probably going to get in trouble with my Pentecostal friends here. But, I mean, a lot of my Pentecostal friends are going to agree with me, but there are, there's a contingency of Pentecostalism that I just don't fit with. I just don't fit with it. And, and Foursquare is a big tent. There's a lot of people within Foursquare that are all across the spectrum. And there are some people in Foursquare that I fit well with, and there are some people in Foursquare that don't fit in that category. And so...
So I asked you a question earlier about your identity, your self-identity within Pentecostalism, and I even started this whole interview with how did a Pentecostal get into patristics? But
right.
I guess the other question to flip it around is, has the study of patristics reinforced, as you laid it out, kind of the distinctives of Pentecostal doctrine, or like Pentecostalism? Has it been challenged by patristics, or does it not have much to say?
There are conversations in patristics about it because there's a group in the patristic period.
What do you mean? Are there particular things like speaking in tongues or women in
well,
ministry?
just Pentecostal in general, Pentecostalism in general.
Okay.
So there's a group in the patristic period called the Montanists.
Right. Can you, for those who aren't familiar, can you give a brief on who they were?
Yeah. So we actually don't know a ton about them, like a lot of people in the ancient world. But there seems to be a guy named Montanus and a couple of women. I forget their names off the top of my head. That. If you look at what is happening in their ministry, it seems to be somewhat comparable to what Pentecostalism claims now. and depending on who you read in historical theology, they are condemned as heretics. And so there is a conversation about that sort of thing in patristics. I think that the case against them doesn't really hold, and I mean the case from now, not the case then. I think the case then, I don't think they actually were really condemned. I think they get referred to as being condemned, but we don't see them. And I may be wrong about this. Some patristics expert that's listening to this can definitely correct me. But I don't think they're not condemned at Nicaea. They're not condemned at Constantinople, as far as I know. I don't think they're condemned officially in any church canon, in any council, as far as I'm aware. Now, I may have missed something. There are people who refer to them as being condemned, but I don't think there's ever actually like hard evidence in history where they are actually condemned. And I think any evidence that exists that could say that is probably condemning them for their lack of hierarchy and not for prophecy or tongues or anything else.
Interesting. Because they stood outside of the church hierarchy.
Because as the church is growing, one of the things that the church needs as it's growing so rapidly in the first 3 or 4 centuries is it needs some sort of structure to protect from heresy, right? And so as it grows, you have this tension between are the leaders, is our priority for the leaders theological orthodoxy or charismatic anything, right? Like, are they a charismatic leader in the sense of like they have charisma, or are they a charismatic leader in the sense of like gifts and stuff like that? And so there's this clash between this that like, would we rather have somebody whose theology is perfect but they kind of suck, right? Like they're just sort of boring, but at least they're going to hold to orthodoxy. Or would we rather have somebody who's exciting and a good leader and yada, 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 but maybe their theology is a little iffy, right? That tension exists in the patristic period, and I think that the primary opposition to the Montanists, and not everybody's opposed to them, the primary opposition to the Montanists pertains to hierarchy. It pertains to, we don't want charismatic leaders, we want orthodox leaders, because we need to stomp out heresy. We need to make sure that we're all holding to the same gospel, holding to the same apostolic deposit. But there are, Tertullian converts to Montanism, if you can call it convert, and there's a whole mess of controversy about, did he actually convert? When did he convert? Did he leave them later? There's a whole conversation about all of that stuff. But I think it's interesting that Tertullian, in his writing against Marcion, just like anybody in the ancient world, he's not satisfied with one refutation of somebody. He wants to give you every possible refutation that he can imagine, right? So he goes through and refutes Marcion biblically at length, but then he also says, where is tongues and prophecy in your church? Because I have that without fail from my church, which means we have the Spirit and you don't, you're a heretic, right? That's not the only refutation, right? Because he's just building this cumulative case.
Yep.
But one of his points is, you don't seem to have the work of the Spirit in your congregation, right? Which I think it's fascinating that that's one of his arguments against Marcion. Irenaeus seems to be in favor of the Montanists. He writes letters of peace to the Bishop of Rome, trying to tell the Bishop of Rome, like, we should accept these people. There's records from, I think, Eusebius of Caesarea saying that they are orthodox in their theology, even though they are condemned. And so there's just a lot of complexity with regard to the Montanists. I started in Gordon Conwell. I started maybe thinking about doing a thesis on Montanism before I finished there. But Gordon Conwell's policy for a thesis is you have to be invited. You can't just say, I want to do a thesis. And my grades at Gordon Conwell were also not great. They were better than my undergraduate, but they were not quite thesis level writing grades. Yeah. And so I talked to Fairbairn about it a couple of times, and he was like, I don't see you being invited to do this. And so I did some research on the Montanists while I was at Gordon Conwell, but not thesis level. I'm not, claiming to be an expert on them. And so, some of this could be a little bit off. It's based on, what I read 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's stuff like that in the patristic period that seems to kind of nudge me towards it seems like there's something there. Now, it's a mixed bag. I mean, church history is a mixed bag. Like some of it it seems like that's not there. But then there's, people having experiences that they can't explain that, I mean, my favorite example is Aquinas near the end of his life has some ecstatic experience that motivates him to stop writing. And he tells his secretary, in comparison to what I just experienced, everything I've written is chaff. And he stops writing. And you're like, okay, well, what was the experience? We don't know. He didn't tell anybody. He was just like, this was incredible. I'm not going to write anything else. Everything I've written is worthless. You're like, it'd be really helpful if you'd write one more thing. What was it? Just one more thing. Just kind of give us a, and so there's stuff like that happens in church history that's like, well, it seems like there's something more, and that's one of the reasons why I like Eastern Orthodoxy, because Eastern Orthodoxy is 100% open to all of that.
That's what I was going to ask you, is that, you've been tempted by these other traditions, and which of them would you feel most at home at outside of Pentecostalism?
Anglican, probably, but also maybe Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Because there's room in Anglicanism to be charismatic.
Yeah.
Bird and Harrower are both open to the gifts, and they're Anglican, and they're, I don't know to what degree they are charismatic, but I know we briefly talked about it one time while I was in the program with them, and they were kind of, open to it. And so there's room in Anglicanism for that sort of stuff. Orthodoxy, there's not just room for it. It's just a part of the thing, right? They're Father Al, the guy that runs Eclectic Orthodoxy, I'm pretty sure it was him that told me this, but it's been a while, that he said that they pray for when you're anointed, right? Your chrismation, right? Chrismation is from charis, and so they're like, we're going to anoint you, and we're going to pray for the gifts, and we're going to pray for God to do things in you, and we believe that that's possible, and and all of that. Yeah. And there's room in Catholicism as well.
Sure.
There's a book on Christian initiation and the baptism of the Holy Spirit by two Catholic priests. I forget their McDonald, I think, is one of them. It's an orange book, if that helps.
do you know which order they were?
I don't remember. Okay. I don't remember. It's been a really long time since I've read that.
Okay.
Yeah, and then in Society of Pentecostal Studies, the sort of the ETS for Pentecostals, there is a subgroup for ecumenical studies, and there are Catholics that are a part of that. So I presented a paper there many years ago, 7 years ago, on speaking in tongues and connection between speaking in tongues and apophatic theology, negative theology, all that kind of stuff, from two church fathers, and it was interesting having Catholic and Orthodox and Pentecostals all in the same room.
That's very
while I'm talking about two church fathers and how they inform our theology of speaking in tongues.
Huh.
It was a unique experience.
Yeah. Would the hold on a second. Here, do you want me?
Oh, yeah.
Would the Orthodox position on women in ministry be a hindrance, though, or a block for you?
Yeah.
Sorry for those listening. The studio is extremely cold, but we're not sick.
Yeah. It would definitely give me pause. But I think there's a little bit of a distinction. There's a little bit of a distinction in Orthodoxy because they're not so preaching centric, right? Like the liturgy isn't about preaching; it's about entering heaven and taking communion in the throne room.
Well, they have like at a Catholic mass, you'll have a homily. Will they do that as well?
They do,
Orthodox?
but it's not the point, you know.
Right. The Eucharist is the point in Catholicism.
Right.
Is it? What is it in Orthodoxy? The same thing.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
The whole thing, you have the iconostasis and all of the icons and all this, the whole idea, as I understand it, which again, from a humble Pentecostal, I could be getting this completely wrong. But as I understand it, the whole idea is in the Eastern Orthodox liturgy is that you're being transported into the very throne room of God and you're taking communion there.
Oh, wow.
And so the icons exist as windows onto heaven that like you're surrounded by these icons because that's where you're going. Right. So we're going to go to heaven and these icons are now those people looking at us while we're in the throne room. Right. That's the idea. Now, again, could totally be wrong about that. That's based on my understanding of it. And so communion's the focus. They do a homily, but the homily is like just a part of it, right? Like you do all of this other stuff, and then in the midst of it, it's like we're going to take communion, we're going to do a homily, and then we're going to finish the liturgy, and then we're all going to go home. And so the homily is just sort of like an add-on, and so since preaching is not like, I mean, the Eucharist is the primary thing in Catholicism. It's the primary thing in Orthodoxy. In evangelicalism, it's the teaching of the Scriptures.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The Eucharist might not even happen every week.
Yep.
Right? Depending on what church you go to, which that's a whole other rabbit trail entirely that is very frustrating to me. But since preaching is not kind of the center stage, they're not allowing women to be priests who preside over the liturgy. I don't really care about that. Like, I mean, like that's probably bad of me to say, but like my contention for women in ministry is women's ability to lead and preach. It's not connected to the liturgy, right? And so, I mean, if Father Sam's prayers are granted and a door opens for me to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, and I suppose I'll have to cross that bridge when I get there. But as it sits right now, I mean, to me, when I've gone to a Catholic church, when I've gone to an Orthodox church, preaching and teaching just isn't the central thing. And so as long as they would be open to women preaching and teaching, then I'm good with it. Like that doesn't really bother me. Yeah, that would be the priority.
Yeah. It's interesting because the way that I've been thinking recently about Roman Catholicism is that, and as I've read more about the place of Mary, there's some great books on that, like Brant Petra's book.
Yeah. Everything he writes is
everything
good.
he writes.
Everything
amazing.
he writes is good.
Yeah, I have a few of his books upstairs that they're just so good and so well done. But that even though you could look from the outside at, let's just take Catholicism and be like, oh, they don't let women be, priests. It's like, well, have you read what their thoughts are on Mary?
Right.
Right. In a sense, women are elevated to a status much higher.
Yeah.
Even than within Protestantism.
Yeah.
In general, because of the elevated stature of Mary, and when you lift Mary up, you lift up all the other barren women of the Old Testament, who preceded her, who were in essence types of, the Mother of God.
Yeah.
So, but I hear you on that. It's an interesting way that you're coming at it. I think with that perspective, and it seems like the gifts and women in ministry are really kind of the main issues for you, or kind of linchpins of your theological perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I would say some kind of experience with the Spirit that is weird, like however we want to characterize that. Like, I think the Spirit just does weird stuff, and it's hard for me to get out of the Spirit doing weird stuff, and not just speaking in tongues, just like there are times that, and this, I'm not saying this happens often. It doesn't even kind of even come close to happening often. But there are some times, infrequent though they may be, where I know things and I don't know how I know them. Like they just happen. Like it's just there. And it's usually in the context of praying for somebody. It's usually in the context of trying to help somebody. And it's usually knowing something about their circumstance to try to help them. And that is weird, and I don't know how to get away from that. Like that I've experienced that, and I don't like that is not the burrito I ate for lunch, right? Like that is the Holy Spirit doing something in his body to help us out. And so it's that sort of thing that I just have a hard time getting away from that because I've seen it happen. One of the first times that ever happened to me, I was in youth ministry, and we had a youth church of probably about 80 to 100 kids. So there's like 7 or 8 of us in youth ministry that were like leaders. There was one youth pastor, and we had basically a youth church, right? And so we had kids come up for prayer after the sermon, and this one kid came up, and I mean, generally every week it was just like, a boy comes up and he's struggling with porn, and you're like, shocker, you're 16, I'm blown away, and it's just it's typical youth ministry stuff, right? And this one week, this kid came up to me, and he said, I need prayer. And I was like, well, do you want to talk about it at all? And he's like, no, I don't want to talk about it. I was like, okay, bud, that's cool, So I put my hand on his shoulder, and I start to pray for him, and it was just like, I just knew that his parents were getting a divorce.
Oh, wow.
And that they were trying to force him to choose who he wanted to live with.
Oh, man. Yeah.
And that was just there. And, and so I stopped praying, and I start talking to him, and I'm like, is this what's happening? And he starts crying. And I'm like, buddy, I'm sorry. And, try to counsel him through it a little bit, and connected him with youth pastor, and, prayed for him some more, and, all that kind of stuff. And for the rest of the night, I'm just like out of my mind. Like, how did that happen? Like, and I believed, like, this is a Pentecostal church. So like I'd heard people talk about stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so I like propositionally believed that could happen. Then it happens to me, and I'm like, that is weird. Like, I know something and I don't know how I know it. Like, that is just, and that's happened to me in a bunch of other scenarios as well. I mean, like I said, it doesn't happen like every day or even every month or probably even every year. But it happens enough that I'm like, that happens. And I don't know another explanation for it outside of Scripture.
Yeah.
Like, this is something that the Holy Spirit is doing for his people. And it's not like I ever know something to hurt somebody, right? Like, it's always, this is something that I now know to be able to help this person, whatever, right? And that's not a thing, that's not a button I can press. That's not something that I can manipulate to make happen. That's something that just happens sometimes because the Holy Spirit's like, here you go.
Yeah.
And so for me, like, it's that kind of thing that, like, I can't get away from that. And then women in ministry, when I was at Gordon Conwell, one of the last classes that I took was New Testament's use of the Old Testament. And I took it with Brian Abishano, who did his PhD on Paul's use of the Old Testament in Romans 9-11 at Aberdeen. And so he knows a few things about the Old Testament's use or New Testament's use of the Old Testament. So I take this directed study with him, and the last thing in the class was to write a paper on a place where the New Testament uses the Old Testament. And so I was like, I'm going to do 1 Timothy 2. Like, that is like the central battleground for, whether or not women can preach. 1 Corinthians 14 is pretty easy to deal with. Could kind of go either way. Like, it's fine. 1 Timothy 2, that's the tough one. So that's what I'm going to do, you know. And so I write this paper, and I'm like, I mean, there was like a couple of months where I was like, I might be a complementarian. Like, I don't know. You know, like, maybe I'm wrong. This is a hard passage.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And just kept going and kept going. He just kept reading more and looking at the passage and over and over and over and over and over again, and then just finally settled on what I think is happening there, and really felt like I feel like I have a good explanation for this passage. And I wrote the paper and I turned it into Abishano. Abishano's complementarian. And he was like, it's a great paper. It's a great argument. You're wrong. But if you want to get it published, I think it's probably a good argument, you know? And so I got it published, and with the journal that exists within my denomination, Foursquare Scholars Fellowship. And so they did an issue on women in ministry, and we had Craig Keener write an article, and a few other people in Foursquare wrote articles, and then I submitted my article for 1 Timothy 2. So I have a journal where I have an article beside Craig Keener's article, which, I mean, what more could you ask for?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That's the coolest. And so yeah, I mean, I'm convinced, I'm convinced of the egalitarian position. I could see, you know, since then, that paper, there's a guy in my denomination who's a higher up in the denomination that read that paper and then asked me to do a presentation on it at an annual convention. And so I did that. And then since then, I've been asked to go to a few places and present the same thing. And so this past yesterday I was preaching at a church in Ohio, and that was the message that I preached was 1 Timothy 2 and kind of why I think it says what it says and that kind of thing. But that's kind of become like my thing in my denomination is I've kind of become the egalitarian guy, the women in ministry guy. But in the presentation, if I give the longer version of it, depending on how much time I have, in the longer version of it, I say, I quote Craig Blomberg in the Two Views on Women in Ministry, where there's one by Tom Schreiner, one by Craig Blomberg, and then one by Linda Belleville, and one by Craig Keener. So 2 views, but there's 4 articles. Blomberg and Keener are the 2 best in that book by far. And I don't mean any offense to Schreiner or Belleville. They're great scholars, but I don't find their articles in that book to be particularly all that useful. Blomberg is complementarian. Belleville's the egalitarian. So egalitarians are Keener and Belleville. So I quote Blomberg, and I'm like, this is my favorite complementarian, if I'm permitted to have such a thing, you know, as an egalitarian. And he's got a bunch of he just drops bombs in that chapter of his. And the best one out of the whole thing that I quote near the end of my presentation is he says, once you've decided what you believe Scripture permits women to do, can a neutral observer of your church tell that you're bending over backwards to get women into those roles? And if not, you're not obeying Scripture even on your own interpretation of it.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so
what kind of roles would that include?
So Blomberg's perspective is that that basically women are limited from being an elder. And outside of that, he believes women can teach. I don't know that he would say they can preach. I think maybe preaching is reserved for elders. I don't recall exactly what he says about that. But he basically says that churches are elder-run and that women can't be elders. But outside of that specific role, they can do anything. And so that's his take on things. And I think that last line, that, you know, if you have a list of what you think women can do, are you doing everything you can to have women do those things in your church. And if you're not, then you're not obeying Scripture even by your own interpretation of it. I think that is, and I say this in the presentation, I'm like, if I were ever to be a complementarian, I would be a Craig Blomberg complementarian.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That there are limitations to women, but outside of that, let's get women into all of these other roles because we have historically sucked at that. Now
when you say we, do you mean the entire church, or is that particular groups within, like traditions? Like we've talked about these major groups within. Are there some that have done it better than others?
I mean, marginally so, I think. But even Foursquare, Foursquare is founded by a woman in 1923, right? Foursquare, it is as egalitarian as you can get. And if you go through Foursquare churches, most of the pastors are men.
Sure, that's right. But even the ones that have female pastors or elders, how are they doing in the area of other areas of ministry?
Oh, you mean like for Blomberg to say like what get them released into everything else?
Right?
Yeah.
Because that tends to be the focus, right?
Yeah.
Is that one or that main role of preaching?
Yeah.
But again, like what about all the other kind of not titles but functions within the body of Christ?
Yeah.
Where we should, whether you're egalitarian or complementarian, and for those listening who don't know, egalitarian essentially means women and men are equal and can fulfill all the same roles in the church, whereas complementarian says that, well, men have their roles within the church and so do women, but there are, correct me if I'm wrong, there's at least one role that's restricted to men only, which would be elder or
or for some people it'd be senior pastor or I think I'm not sure if I'm qualified to say how people have done, how well they've done that, but in my experience in most churches that I've gone to, whether it's visiting or attending or even being a minister there, it does seem to be that church is, it's really ironic because people complain that church is too feminine, and yet the vast majority of church leadership is masculine. I mean, most worship leaders are men, and maybe children's pastors, but most youth pastors are men. Most people engaged in any kind of ministry in the church, most of them are going to tend to be men. Yeah. And I'm not against men being in ministry. I'm a man who's in ministry, but I look at my mom, who is a superhuman, and it's baffling to me that anybody would think that she wouldn't be fit to do something in the church. Now maybe there's some limitations to that or whatever, I don't think there are, but I'm open to, the dialogue on it. But I see people like that. I see people like my daughter is going to rule the world one day. Like, all our parenting is going to do is determine whether she is a benevolent dictator or a tyrannical overlord, right? Like, we're only going to be able to move the needle towards her being nice to the people she's in charge of. Yeah. Like, and in Christianity, you take my two children, right? Marshall is, if you take the typical way that people define gender, Marshall is more feminine because Marshall is more passive and quiet and, all of those things, right? The stereotypical gender roles. My daughter, Mia, is more masculine. She's louder, more headstrong, yada, yada, yada. The way that the church presents those, I think that presents problems because it's going to make Marshall feel like he's not actually a man, and it's going to have not kind things to say about my daughter because instead of her having leadership ability or leadership potential, she's, words that we don't say about women, and that's a problem for me, and it's a problem for me personally. Part of this is I was raised by my mom, and so that has an impact on me. But I can remember at a church wants to be respected. Something just beeped. I don't know what that was.
I think we're good.
Okay. So the woman wants to be loved, man wants to be respected. That's the whole idea. Well, our small group went through that. And almost everybody, almost all the guys in my small group were like ex-military police officers, like your typical man's man,
Yep.
And so we're listening to these videos and they're like, yeah, my woman better respect me. Like I don't care if she loves me, And I'm sitting listening to these videos and I'm like, am I a man? And there have been multiple points in my life where for brief times I've thought like, was I born like legitimately intersex and my parents just made a choice and I've been raised as a man, but I was actually like a little of both, and I, flip of the coin, and I could have been a woman, because the way that people present gender, and that's a difficult thing to try to struggle through, that you're like, if everybody says this is what a man is, well, I'm not that, I spent my time in high school painting and writing poetry, right? Like I'm not, now, and we can say, well, that's because you were raised by your mom. And you didn't have a strong male influence or whatever. Okay, well, maybe that's the case. But it doesn't change the fact that the way that the church presents gender often raises problems, right? This gets us into like the conversation about, LGBTQ. Like if you say this is what men are like and this is what women are like, and you have someone like me who's like, well, I'm not like that. Maybe I'm this, and maybe I need to transition, that's a problem, And so that to me is like, it's one of the things that along with autism that the church just needs a better approach to it, that we can affirm masculinity and say, that's a good thing and that femininity is a good thing without saying like, gosh, if you don't love hunting and shooting guns and eating red meat and, farting and burping, like, then you're not a dude,
Yeah, but I think there's a lot more overlap. Sure, there are those, so the stereotypes, right?
Sure.
Like the ones you just listed, or, the stereotypical woman should be calm, quiet, docile, wear a dress, the trad wife thing, right?
Sure.
But there is a lot of overlap too. Some of the greatest poets and painters in world history were men.
Yeah.
There were some brilliant female ones too.
Yeah.
And there's just so much variety within the way that God has made us that these character traits can't, maybe there are some that are just for men and some that are just for women.
Sure.
But in terms of like character traits, there's overlap.
Yeah.
There's biological things that there's not an overlap.
Yeah.
Women don't have penises and
right.
men don't have vulvas.
Yeah.
So, and even if you surgically manufacture them, they're not the real deal. So
right.
There's ways to still be a man and to not be a hunter, you know?
Yeah.
Or to be a woman and maybe you just don't like kids.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. You're still a woman.
Right.
You're still a man.
Right.
Don't look at the traits that we've that we in this current time in history we're looking at and
Right.
and defining manhood by or femininity by.
Right.
Maybe let's take it like you do with patristics. Like let's
Yeah.
take a look back
Yeah.
and see how things were back then.
Right.
And in their context, that was so-called normal
Yeah.
or accepted.
Yeah.
The stereotypes were different.
Yeah.
And yet there are principles that have carried forward. Like, what is it? Was it Athanasius with the arms spread out to the
Yeah.
Jews
Yeah.
and the Greeks?
Yeah.
Okay, take it or leave it.
Yeah.
But there were other things within what he said
Yeah.
on the incarnation
Yeah.
that today would be like, oh my gosh, like,
Yeah.
yep, I could sign that dotted line
Yeah.
all day.
Yeah, for sure.
So I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the church doesn't need to do a better job in a lot of these areas of like, I would say not so much like how do we treat people. That's true, but like the way that we treat people is going to come from a certain understanding or worldview is an important word that you brought up earlier.
Yeah.
And that's going to be determined by a lot of things,
Yeah.
including the culture we live in,
Yeah.
ideally, fundamentally, scripture, and depending on your church tradition, the tradition, right, and the teaching of the church. And so all these things are going to inform that, but also things like the way you're raised,
Yeah.
I was raised with a very strong father who's still around. You were raised by your mother. We're going to have differences just because of that.
100%.
In the way that we approach even going back to scripture
Yeah.
or the world, how we define manhood, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think I mean I agree that there's a diversity and that we should be. I mean that's basically what I'm getting at. My challenge with this is really comes back to my kids. It's what's being communicated to them and how is that going to impact them, right? Like what message are they hearing from Christianity about what it looks like to be a man, what it looks like to be a woman, and how is that going to impact them growing up?
yeah.
And for my son, he may end up with some of the same struggles that I've had. And for my daughter, I mean, I don't know that anybody could get her to be quiet and not try to take things over, but it's going to get in the way of that, right? And so we try very hard with her to phrase her personality in terms of leadership and not in terms of bossiness. Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because they're both kind of saying the same thing. It's just one is saying it positively and one is saying it negatively. Right. Whereas my son, if he had the same personality that my daughter has, everybody would talk about him as a leader. Nobody would talk about him as bossy. Right. And so that's my concern is for my kids that, especially for my daughter, like trying to emphasize to her, like, it's okay that you want to be in charge. That's not bad. How you get in charge and how you are in charge, that's a different story, right? But the desire to run things, like, I love it. Absolutely. Go, play with your Barbies and you're a professor, like 100%, it's great.
Yeah.
And so, so that's my concern is, and that comes back to the concern with women in ministry is that, girls growing up in a church, like, are they being discipled in a way that allows them to have the strengths that they have? Or are they being discipled in a way that they need to be a trad wife, right? Are they being discipled in a way that, like, you may have a strong personality, but for you to fit in here and for you to be what we really are, you're going to need to dial that back a lot, and that's my concern. Now, and look, I go to an SBC church. It's complementarian, right? And I don't have any problems going, there are some complementarian churches that knock this out of the park and they're doing a great job. And there are some egalitarian churches that suck real bad,
Interesting.
And so, when I give that presentation and I get to that slide with Blomberg, I say, if I'm in an egalitarian context, I say, how many women would rather go to Blomberg's complementarian church than one of our egalitarian churches? Because they're going to be released into ministry there, but they're not going to be released into ministry here, even though we believe in it. You know, there are some egalitarian churches that are egalitarian in name only, you know, and like, just be what you are. You know, like if those are your values, then just own it. You know, like just be what you are. You know, and so so that to me. I mean, getting back to the question about Pentecostalism and like what are the, you know, the spirit being weird, women in ministry, and then I mean also it's less of a combative issue for me. It used to be a big combative issue for me. I'm not a Calvinist. I'm not anti-reformed because I think the Reformed tradition includes space for people who are not a Calvinist, even though a lot of my Calvinist friends don't like to be called Calvinists. They like to be called Reformed. I think Reformed is a bigger tent than Calvinist. Anyway, and so I'm not anti-Reformed, though I do think there are some bad things that came from the Reformation. I don't think it was all bad. I think it was probably mostly good. But that, you know, that sort of like approach to soteriology, I struggle with. I could be maybe moderately Calvinistic, but that is not where I'm going to lean. So in Pentecostalism, generally Pentecostalism tends to be Arminian in one shape or another. And so Pentecostalism having the, you know, weird stuff from the Spirit, women in ministry, and then soteriologically being Arminian, it's kind of where I'm at. So.
Sounds like you're a Jesuit.
So you're going to throw rocks at me.
Yeah. For context, for those listening, we live directly across the street from Aquinas College, which is one of the, I think, the premier Roman Catholic colleges in the U.S. And we have Dominican friars walking by just outside our house all the time in the white habits, but not Jesuits.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if I saw a Jesuit who traditionally I think wore the black habit,
I think so.
If I saw one of them walking by, I'd throw rocks at him. Hey man, it's been really good having you here.
Yeah.
I'm honored that this was the first episode or interview of kind of this relaunch since my previous podcast got shut down a year ago. And the funny thing though, well, maybe it's not funny, but I never would have been able to have you on.
Yeah.
That other show.
Yeah.
Because the place that was hosting that podcast was very much kind of like the Dutch Reformed.
Yeah.
It's very Calvinist.
Yeah.
Very cessationist.
Yeah.
Very definitely complementarian.
Yeah.
You would not have been an approved guest.
Yeah. They would have had to redact a lot of the conversation. Yeah.
We could have maybe talked about autism.
Yeah. Autism and maybe some patristics.
I don't know. Yeah. Maybe some patristics.
Maybe.
For sure.
Yeah. Augustine, you know.
Definitely Augustine.
Yeah. He's the one approved one.
A little bit of Origen.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming out.
Yeah, man.
This meant a lot. I think just you have a lot to offer the church. We need more patristic scholars from not just like Catholic scholars.
Yeah.
Like I had some great interactions with Louis Ayres when I was at Durham. He's still a friend of mine, and
yeah, he's brilliant.
Brilliant. Horribly crazy, funny. He's like a British Mike Bird.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I have a friend who did his PhD under Ayres.
Who was that?
Eric Lopez.
Okay.
Eric Lopez. Yeah,
okay.
He did his PhD under Ayres. It's been a minute.
Do you know Sean Wilhite?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know him, but I know who he is.
So he did his second doctorate under Lewis.
Because why not?
He's a monster.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just been so good to have you on.
Yeah, man.
And what people listening won't know is this is the first time you and I have ever spent any time together in person.
Yeah.
Our entire relationship has been Facebook Messenger.
Yeah, yeah. The guy that I preached for on Sunday, he was like, "You've got my number, so if it takes a weird turn because you've never met this guy," and I'm like, "I'm gonna be okay. I'm gonna be okay." Like, yeah, we've known each other for a long time, even if we've never physically met. So,
And I honestly don't remember how we first met, but I do know that I was hiring you, I guess, on a contractual basis as a writer for the Logos Bible Software's academic blog.
yeah.
Oh, that's right. And I was telling my wife how you wrote the most viral post that we had ever experienced on the blog, and it was the one on like how to get
advanced Bible degree for free.
yeah, and it had
Yeah.
all these amazing links to like you basically put together a whole. This is the autism in you. You put together this whole chart
Yeah.
of like, okay, here's like I don't know if it was like 96 credit
Yeah.
degree, and here's links to all these free courses that are
Yeah.
equivalent.
Yeah.
And man, that thing just flew.
Yeah.
The only thing that passed it was Matt Halstead. I don't know if you know Matt, but he's what is he? Well, he's a scholar here in the U.S., but he wrote these posts during COVID on like end time stuff,
Okay.
and people ate that up.
Okay.
So, but yours still was in the number 2 or 3 spot forever.
Yeah. I still send a link for that to people because I
Really?
get into conversations with people and they're like asking about resources online. And I'm like, well, there's biblicaltraining.org and there's Seminary Now and there's all this
this
stuff
thing I
on
wrote.
YouTube.
Yeah.
And they're like, how do you find all that? And I'm like, well, there's this blog I wrote and it lists out everything. And, so it's still getting hits, somewhere. So
Thanks, man. But honestly, you have so much stuff for the church with this patristics study, and keep going for it and be useful and use all those jars to educate us. Not necessarily that we all, as Protestants, become Catholic.
Sure.
Maybe that won't be a bad thing, but that we would really honor and respect and derive benefit from not just the tradition we come from and so-called, like we call it church history, but these were living human beings filled with the Spirit who wrote from that.
These are our brothers and sisters in Christ.
They are. Yeah. They are. And they had and they have things to say to us still that will only bring us closer to the Lord, closer to each other, and just to a place of, I think, more appreciation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks, man.
Yeah, dude. Thanks for
do it
having me.
again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is fun.
All right. Thanks, everyone.